Welcome back, my family. Before we dive into tonight's creepy little journey, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves a good scare before bed. I would love to know where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. So drop it down in the comments and hype me up a little on YouTube. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let us step into tonight's story.
The only rule was simple. Never open the basement door. It was not shouted. It was not even framed like a warning. Mrs. Holloway said it the way people mention house shoes or where to put the trash, like it was just part of keeping things tidy. She handed me an envelope of cash on her front porch, the porch light buzzing faintly above us, and she nodded toward the hallway like she did not want to look at the door for too long. I was in my early 20s, broke in a boring, practical way. The kind of broke where you count gas money twice and still take the job. I had found her flyer on a community board near a laundromat off County Road 6, wedged between piano lessons and a lost cat notice. Light housekeeping, cash. That was all it said. No company name, no phone number printed clean, just a number written in pen, as if she had torn the paper off and rewritten it more than once. The house sat a little outside town, where the road stopped pretending it belonged to anyone. Tall grass, a gravel drive, trees close enough to make the air feel shaded even in daylight. Inside, it was colder than it should have been, with curtains pulled tight across too many windows. No television noise, no radio, just the little mechanical life of the place. An old refrigerator humming, the HVAC breathing through a vent in the floor, the soft creak of wood whenever I shifted my weight. The basement door was at the end of the hallway. Thick, painted over so many times the edges looked swollen. Newer hardware on older wood. A latch that felt too serious for storage. I noticed it right away, because something in me always notices exits and locks, and the places a person could hide if they had to. Mrs. Holloway noticed me noticing. She did not raise her voice. She did not step in front of me. She just said very clearly, like she was reading a line she had read to other people before, "Do not open that door." I remember giving a little laugh, the kind you do to prove you are normal. I said, "Of course," like I was agreeing to not use someone else's bathroom. And for the first few days, I did not even think about it. I swept her kitchen. I wiped the counters with pine sol that stung my nose. I took her trash out to a bin that smelled like wet leaves. I listened to the house breathe. Then came Friday night, when she asked me to stay over just in case, and the place got so quiet I could hear the refrigerator click off mid-hum. That was the first time I heard it. Not a voice, not footsteps. A soft scrape from below the floor, like a chair leg dragging across concrete, slow, careful, deliberate. And that was the moment I realized the rule was not about the basement being dirty. It was about the basement being occupied. I broke the rule anyway. I opened the door. I went down there with a flashlight and a bat like I was the brave one in my own story. And what I found waiting in the center of that room was proof, in a way I still cannot explain, that I was not the first person to think I could handle whatever was down there. 1.1. The flyer and the drive. 1,020 words. I found the flyer where people post the kinds of requests they do not want to say out loud. It was taped crooked on a community board by the front windows of a laundromat that never quite smelled clean, no matter how many dryer sheets the place sold. The cork was scarred with old staples and yellowed pushpins. Piano lessons, babysitting, a lost cat with a blurry photo and a phone number written twice. Under all of that, half hidden behind an ad for a used sofa, was a single sheet of printer paper. Light housekeeping, cash, no logo, no business name, no email, just a phone number written in dark ink like whoever wrote it pressed too hard and did not want to rewrite it again. I stared at it longer than I needed to. That sentence should have felt like luck. Cash jobs were easy. Cash jobs meant no paperwork and no questions and no waiting for direct deposit to clear when your bank account sat so low you could see the bottom. I was in my early 20s and broke in the quiet, ordinary way. The kind of broke where you keep your tank a quarter full and pretend that is a choice. The kind of broke where you eat whatever is cheapest and call it meal prep, because it sounds better than admitting you are cutting corners with a dull blade. When I called the number, a woman answered on the second ring. Her voice was older, calm, and oddly flat. Not rude, not friendly either. Like she had learned that the safest way to speak was to give away as little as possible. I asked about the job. She asked if I had a car. I said yes. She asked if I could come the next afternoon. I said yes again, because the truth is I would have said yes to almost anything that sounded legal and paid in cash. She gave me an address out on the edge of town, a county road, a mailbox number. No directions beyond that, like she assumed I already knew where she lived. Before she hung up, she added one small detail that stuck with me even then. "Do not be late," she said. "Not please, not if you can. Just do not." The next day, I left work early. I had been on shift at a convenience store off the highway, the kind with a microwave burrito carousel and a back room that always smelled like burnt coffee and stale cardboard. I clocked out, washed my hands, and noticed my fingers still carried that faint chemical scent of sanitizer that never quite goes away. The sky was the color of dishwater, late winter in the Midwest, bare trees, the world stripped down to branches and gray pavement and patches of dirty snow that had survived too long. I drove out of town on the main road that ran past a Dollar General and a gas station with harsh neon that made everyone's face look tired. The gas station sign buzzed like a trapped insect. A couple of guys in work jackets leaned against the ice freezer smoking, their breath fogging the air. I remember thinking, stupidly, that I liked that place because it was loud. It was alive. It had noise that proved you were not alone. The county roads outside town were different. They got narrower and quieter, the kind of two-lane stretches where the trees and fields sit back from the asphalt like they are observing you. Houses thinned out. Mailboxes came in clusters, then not at all for long stretches. The radio started to cut in and out, so I turned it off. Wind moved through the empty branches. It made a soft, dry sound, like paper rubbing against paper. I passed a church with a parking lot full of potholes and one lonely basketball hoop. I passed a row of trailers, each with a different kind of neglect. A porch collapsed in on itself, a tarp nailed over a window, a car on blocks that looked like it had been waiting for years to be fixed. Then the address numbers on the mailboxes began to match what she had told me. I slowed down, scanning the right side of the road, feeling that mild unease you get when you realize you are the only moving thing for miles. Her mailbox was rusted and leaning. The post had a slight twist to it, like someone once hit it and never bothered to straighten it. The number was faded but readable. There were no decorations, no little painted flags or seasonal wreath. It looked like a mailbox that did not expect company. The driveway was gravel and wider than it needed to be, like it was designed for more cars than the place currently had. Tall grass poked up along the edges, pale and brittle, bent in the wind. Farther in, the property opened up, and the house revealed itself in a way that made me take my foot off the gas without thinking. It was bigger than I expected. Not mansion big, just too big for one older woman to maintain alone without help. 2 stories, maybe 3 if you counted the attic line. Old wood siding darkened by weather. A porch that ran along the front with railings that had been repainted enough times to look swollen at the corners. What caught my attention most were the windows. There were too many of them, and every single one was covered. Curtains drawn tight. Blinds closed. Some with an extra layer behind the fabric, as if she wanted to make sure no outline ever showed through. I pulled up and parked near the end of the drive. When I turned off my engine, the silence hit hard. My car had been a bubble of sound. The hum of the motor, the faint rattle of the dash, the tires on gravel. The moment it died, the world felt like it leaned in. A porch light was on, even though it was still afternoon. It buzzed faintly. Not loud, but constant, like a small electrical warning. I could hear it from where I sat. I checked the time on my phone and realized I was 5 minutes early. That should have felt like a win. Instead, I sat there for a second longer, staring at the house and trying to tell myself that none of this meant anything. Old houses were weird. Old houses had quirks. Old houses made strange sounds. Old houses kept the cold in the corners and held on to smells like they were part of the structure. That was what I told myself while I stepped out onto the gravel. My shoes sank slightly into softer spots where the driveway had not been packed down. The air smelled like damp wood and leaf rot. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. When I started walking up the path to the porch, the front steps creaked under my weight. It was not the casual creak of an old board. It sounded more deliberate, like the step wanted credit for noticing me. I reached the porch, and the buzz of the porch light got louder. It had that faint oscillation like it could die at any moment, but it never did. The railing felt rough under my fingers when I steadied myself, paint peeling in thin curls. No one came out to greet me. I stood there for a moment, not sure if I should knock or ring a bell. There was no doorbell, just a heavy front door with a brass knob that looked newer than everything around it. The knob had a sheen that suggested it was touched often, cleaned often, used often. I knocked once. The sound was dull, absorbed by thick wood. I waited. The house stayed silent. No TV noise, no music, no muffled voices, not even the faint clatter of someone moving around inside. Only the porch light buzz and the wind brushing the dead grass. I knocked again, a little harder. This time I heard something. A single sound from inside, subtle enough that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. It was like a soft shift of weight on wood, a floorboard answering quietly from somewhere beyond the door. Then the lock clicked. The door opened, and an older woman stood in the gap, keeping most of her body behind the door like she did not want to give the porch too much of herself. She was smaller than I expected, gray hair pulled back, face lined in a way that made it hard to read her expression. Her eyes moved over me quickly, from my shoes up to my hands, then back to my face. She did not smile. She did not frown either. She simply looked like someone checking a list. "You are early," she said. It was not a compliment. It was an observation. I forced a small laugh and held up my hands like I was harmless. "Yeah, traffic was better than I thought." She opened the door a little wider and stepped back, allowing me in. Warm air did not meet me. The inside of the house felt cold, not like the heat was off, but like the walls themselves did not believe in warmth. And as I crossed the threshold, I heard the porch steps creak one more time behind me, even though my foot was no longer on them, like the house had decided to speak again. She closed the door with care. The latch settled. The silence on the other side was complete. Then she said, calm and plain, like she was telling me where to put my coat. Before you start, there is one rule. 1.2 Mrs. Holloway's House Rules, 130 words. Up close, Mrs. Holloway looked even older than her voice had suggested on the phone. Not fragile exactly. More like carefully assembled. She stood with her shoulders set back as if posture was something she had trained into her bones over decades. Her gray hair was pulled tight. No loose strands, no softness. Even her hands looked deliberate. Fingers folded together at her waist, like she was posing for a photograph that would last a long time. She did not introduce herself the way most people do. No nice to meet you, no small-town friendliness. She simply watched me step inside, then shut the door with a controlled, patient motion, making sure the latch caught. The click sounded loud in the quiet. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. Under that, something damp, like a basement that had been closed too long. The house was dim despite the afternoon light outside. Curtains covered every window. The lamps that were on gave off a weak yellow glow that did not spread far. I turned a little, taking it in, and the floor beneath me gave a soft creak, as if it had been waiting to confirm my weight. Mrs. Holloway noticed the way my eyes moved. "Shoes off," she said. It was not rude. It was not warm. It was simply the next line. Like she had said it so many times, she could say it in her sleep. I slipped off my shoes and set them neatly by the door. The floor felt cool through my socks. The silence made my movements feel bigger than they should have been. When I shifted my bag strap on my shoulder, the fabric made a small rasping sound that seemed to echo off the hallway walls. Mrs. Holloway moved deeper into the house, and I followed her automatically. The way you do when you are in someone else's space, and you do not want to seem uncertain. She led me down a short hallway where the walls were covered with framed photos that were too dark to see clearly. I caught glimpses, faces maybe, family. The glass reflected the lamps more than the images themselves. At the end of the hall, she gestured with her chin toward a doorway on the right. "Kitchen," she said. The kitchen was neat, but not in a comforting way. It was neat like a place that had stopped being lived in and had started being maintained. The counters were bare except for a dish rack that held exactly 3 plates, all stacked perfectly. A small calendar hung on the wall with the days crossed out in tight, straight lines. There was a refrigerator, old and white, the kind that hummed steadily and then clicked off with a heavy final breath. The hum was the loudest thing in the room. Mrs. Holloway pointed without looking at me. "Wipe counters, sink, stovetop, floor." She paused, like she was waiting for those words to settle into place. Then she walked me through the rest of the downstairs the same way. Living room, vacuum, dust, straighten the throw pillows, do not move the furniture. The room was dark, even with lamps on. The curtains were pulled so tight, the fabric looked stretched. There was no television, no stereo, just a silent corner where a TV would normally sit, like a missing tooth. Hallway, sweep, wipe the baseboards. Laundry, empty the lint trap, wipe the top of the washer, fold what was in the basket. She never said please, but she never sounded angry. She spoke like someone reciting instructions she had already recited so many times that they had become a script. I nodded along, trying to appear normal, trying to appear grateful. In my head, I was already counting how long it would take. An hour, maybe 2. Easy money. Then we reached the end of the hallway again, and I saw the door I had noticed from the porch side of the house. The basement door. It sat at the very end of the hall like a full stop. Thick wood, painted over so many times the edges looked swollen. The knob was brass and newer than it should have been. A metal latch was fixed above it, also newer. The hardware had a clean, purposeful look, like it had been replaced, not because it was broken, but because someone had needed it to be reliable. My eyes went there without me choosing it. Mrs. Holloway's eyes went there too. She did not hurry. She did not change her expression. She simply waited until she had my attention, then spoke in the same calm tone she had used for the kitchen counters. "The basement is not part of your work." She said it gently, almost kindly, like she was saving me the trouble. But her eyes did not blink when she said it. Not once. Not even a soft half blink the way people do without thinking. She stared at me as if she needed to make sure the sentence landed in my body, not just my ears. I forced a small smile because that is what you do when someone sets a boundary. You smile to show you respect it. "Okay," I said. "No problem." She held my gaze for another second, then nodded. The movement was minimal, precise, like a stamp being pressed. "Good," she said. And that was it. She turned away as if the subject was closed. We went back toward the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed again, then clicked, then settled into that steady, low vibration that makes you stop noticing it after a while. The HVAC vent in the floor exhaled lukewarm air in a slow, tired cycle. Somewhere in the walls, the house shifted, a soft tick like wood adjusting. Outside, wind brushed dead grass, faint and distant, like a whisper you could not translate. I realized something then. There was no other noise, no TV murmuring in another room, no radio playing softly, no phone ringing, not even the dull background chatter that comes from neighbors if you live close enough to hear them. The soundscape was stripped down to nothing but the house itself. Mechanical breathing, old wood, wind. It made every small sound feel important. When I started working, I became hyper-aware of my own presence. The swish of a rag on the counter, the squeak of my socks on the floor, the way the vacuum cord tapped against my leg as I dragged it behind me. Even my breathing sounded too loud in the living room, as if the air itself was listening. Mrs. Holloway watched for a while without speaking. Then she moved to a chair in the corner of the kitchen and sat with her hands folded in her lap, facing the hallway. Not watching me exactly, watching the line of sight that ended at the basement door. I tried not to stare at her. I tried not to stare at the curtains. But the dimness bothered me. It was still daytime. The sky outside was gray, but it was bright enough that normal people would leave a window uncovered. The house felt like it was refusing daylight on purpose. After I finished wiping the kitchen counters, I drifted toward one of the living room windows and reached for the edge of a curtain, telling myself I just wanted a little more light, just enough to see the dust better. I pulled it back maybe 2 inches. A thin slice of daylight cut through the room, pale and cold. For half a second, it felt like relief. Then I sensed someone behind me. Not footsteps, not a creak. Nothing that warned me, just the sudden pressure of another person in the space. I turned my head, and Mrs. Holloway was there, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something powdery and old-fashioned. Her face was inches from my shoulder, her eyes fixed on the gap of light like it offended her. My stomach tightened. She did not speak. She reached past me and took the curtain between her fingers. Her hand was steady. She pulled the fabric closed again, slow and precise, smoothing it as she went, making sure there was no crack left for light to slip through. When she finished, she looked at me with that same unblinking focus. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle. "We keep those closed," she said. It sounded like a preference, but it carried the weight of something practiced. I swallowed and nodded. "Sorry, I just thought it might help." She stared for one more beat, then stepped away as silently as she had arrived, returning to her chair in the kitchen as if nothing unusual had happened. I stood there in the dim living room, staring at the curtain she had closed, feeling embarrassed in a way that did not match what had happened, because I was not embarrassed for touching her curtain. I was embarrassed because I had reacted like someone who had been caught doing something wrong. And somewhere down the hallway, behind that thick basement door, the house made a small settling sound, so soft I could not be sure it was real. But it landed in my nerves anyway. I went back to cleaning, telling myself I was overthinking it, telling myself the rule was just a rule. And for the next hour, I did my best not to look toward the end of the hallway again. 1.3, the door that looks back. 1,000 words. By the time I finished the kitchen and moved on to the hallway, I had stopped thinking of the house as quiet. Quiet implies peace. Quiet implies absence. This place was not quiet. It was muted. Like someone had turned the world's volume down on purpose and left only the sounds that mattered. The hallway was narrow and dim, lit by a single lamp on a small table. The bulb had that soft, tired glow that made everything look older than it was. Framed photos lined the wall. Dark glass, unreadable faces. The floorboards under my socks creaked with every shift of weight, but the creaks did not feel random. They felt measured, like the house was keeping track. At the end of the hallway sat the basement door. It looked heavier the longer I stood near it, not in a dramatic way, just in the way a thing looks when it has been used for something serious. Thick wood, too many layers of paint, the edges swollen where years of moisture and repainting had built up like scar tissue. The knob was brass and newer than the rest of the hallway, polished in a way that suggested hands touched it often, but never casually. Above the knob was the latch Mrs. Holloway had mentioned without pointing to it. That latch was the detail that kept pulling my eyes back. The latch did not match. The screws were clean and bright. The metal had no rust. It looked like it had been installed recently. Recently enough that whoever did it cared about getting it aligned straight. It belonged on a different door in a different decade. I told myself that was normal. Old houses get repairs. People replace parts. That was the sensible explanation. Still, when I bent to wipe the baseboards near that door, I found myself moving more slowly than I needed to, listening without meaning to. The refrigerator hummed somewhere behind me. The HVAC vent exhaled and then went quiet again. The house settled with tiny ticks, like it was cooling or warming or shifting into a more comfortable position. I wiped along the baseboard, and my rag made a soft, shushing sound. I moved a little closer to the basement door, just cleaning, just doing the job. That was when I heard it. A faint click. Not the loud, hollow clunk of pipes. Not the ping of metal cooling. It was smaller than that, more precise, like a latch moving half an inch, like something on the other side of the door had shifted and found a resting point. I froze with my hand still on the baseboard. The click was not followed by anything. No footsteps, no voices, nothing that would confirm it as real. I forced a laugh under my breath, because sometimes you do that to prove to yourself you are not scared. Pipes, I whispered, as if saying the word would make it true. I went back to wiping. 2 minutes later, I stood again, this time to sweep the hallway. The broom bristles scratched lightly against the wood, gathering dust that did not look like normal dust. It was fine and pale, like powdered drywall or something old that had been ground down over time. As I swept toward the end of the hallway, I took another step closer to the basement door. Click. It came again. The exact same kind of small, settling sound. I felt it go up the back of my neck in a way that had nothing to do with logic. The timing was too perfect. Not impossible, not supernatural. Just too neat. I stopped sweeping and listened. Nothing. The refrigerator hummed. The house breathed. The lamp bulb buzzed faintly. It could have been anything. It could have been the latch itself settling. It could have been air pressure changing when the HVAC turned on. It could have been the kind of coincidence that only feels personal when you are alone in someone else's house. That was what I told myself. But I did not move closer. I finished the hallway quickly after that, keeping the broom bristles away from the base of the basement door, as if dusting too close might count as breaking a rule. When I carried the dust pile toward the kitchen trash, I avoided looking at the latch altogether. Mrs. Holloway sat in her kitchen chair, hands folded, staring down the hallway like she was waiting for something she would never admit to. When I asked where she kept extra trash bags, she did not turn her head. "Hallway drawer," she said. She pointed with 2 fingers, a small gesture that made it clear she did not want to stand up. I walked back down the hallway, the floor creaking under each step. The drawer was part of a narrow side table beneath one of the framed photos. I crouched and pulled it open. Inside were ordinary things at first. A roll of tape, a couple of pens, a small flashlight with a dead battery, rubber bands, a stack of folded paper towels. Then, tucked toward the back, was a plastic-wrapped pack of blank name tags. The kind temp workers wear at orientation. The kind you peel and stick to your shirt before anyone knows your name. White rectangles with a thin red border. All identical, all blank. The pack looked out of place. It was too new, too modern for the rest of the drawer. Like someone had bought it specifically and then hidden it. I slid it out and turned it over in my hands. The plastic crinkled loudly in the quiet hallway. I felt silly for being uneasy about something so normal. Then I noticed one tag near the top was not truly blank. There was no ink on it, no visible writing. But the surface was slightly dented, as if a pen had pressed into the tag above it hard enough to leave an impression. I tilted it toward the lamplight and watched the indentation appear. "Do not go down." The words were faint, like a ghost of handwriting, but clear enough that my stomach dropped anyway. For a second, I could not move. I stared at it and tried to assemble a reasonable explanation. Maybe Mrs. Holloway had a sense of humor. Maybe she had made the tags for a party joke once. Maybe she had written warnings for herself because she was forgetful. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. I swallowed, slid the pack back into the drawer exactly the way I found it, and closed it softly. My fingers were cold. When I turned around, I realized I was facing the basement door again. It sat there at the end of the hall, unchanged, silent, thick with paint and history and the wrong kind of new hardware. I took one step toward it without thinking, just to prove I could. Just to prove I was in control of my own legs. Click. A soft, precise sound from the other side, as if something had shifted to acknowledge me. I stopped. I did not laugh this time. The rational part of my brain started doing math. Air pressure, wood settling, pipes, timing coincidence. It stacked explanations like sandbags against a flood. But another part of me, the part that had recognized danger in people's voices before they ever raised them, did not care about math. That part of me understood one simple truth. The door did not feel like a door. It felt like a boundary. I finished the rest of the work with my eyes lowered and my movements careful. When I accepted the envelope of cash from Mrs. Holloway, I thanked her too quickly. I put my shoes on by the front door and felt relief the moment my fingers touched the cold metal of my car keys. Outside, the air was sharp and clean compared to the house. The wind smelled like winter and dirt and nothing else. I drove away with the heater blasting, trying to shake off the feeling that the house had watched me leave. Halfway back toward town, I realized something that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. My car smelled like her house. Not just a little. Not just like cleaner on my hands. It was in the fabric of my jacket, in my hair, in the inside of the car itself, like I had spilled something unseen onto the seats. Cold wood, damp earth. That closed, underground smell you get when you open a cellar after months. I rolled the window down despite the freezing air, and the wind tore into the car. The smell did not leave, and for the rest of the drive, with the neon of the gas station finally appearing ahead like a promise of normal life, I kept thinking about the name tag indentation. Do not go down. It did not feel like a warning for me. It felt like a reminder someone had already needed. 2.1. Daylight that feels like night. 1,040 words. I told myself I was not going back. That was the conversation I had with myself in my kitchen that night, standing at my sink with my hands under hot water until my skin went pink. I scrubbed the lemon cleaner smell off my fingers. I washed my jacket. I wiped down the steering wheel. I cracked my apartment windows even though the air outside was sharp enough to hurt my lungs. The damp earth smell stayed anyway. It was not strong. That was almost worse. It was faint, persistent, like a memory you cannot stop replaying. Every time my car heater kicked on, it pushed that smell back into my face. Cold wood. Something sealed. Something that had been shut for a long time. The next morning, I woke up to the plain fact of my bank account and the plain fact of rent. The day did not care what my nerves wanted. The day cared about bills. So I went back. I did it in a way that made me feel like a liar. I told myself it was only for one more shift, one more envelope of cash, one more easy cleaning job. I told myself the name tag imprint could have been old. I told myself I had started to scare myself because the house was quiet and I had been alone. I even practiced a version of my memory that sounded harmless. It was just a weird old lady. It was just a creepy house. It was nothing. The drive out there felt longer the second time. The same county road, the same bare trees, the same gray sky pressed low over the fields. I passed the gas station with the harsh neon and considered pulling in just to be around people. I did not. I kept going, and the world thinned out again, and the radio faded into static until I shut it off. When I reached her mailbox, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The driveway gravel looked disturbed, not dramatically, just like a car had been in and out recently, more recently than it should have. Tracks pressed into the light dust on top, a little ridge of gravel pushed toward the grass. I told myself it was her. Maybe a nurse, maybe family, maybe a neighbor. I parked in the same spot and sat there with my hands on the wheel. The porch light was on again, even though it was mid-morning. It buzzed faintly like a sick insect. I remember thinking, who leaves a porch light on in full daylight? Then I remembered the way she closed the curtains like she was sealing something in. I forced myself to get out of the car. The gravel popped under my shoes with sharp, dry little snaps. The tall grass along the driveway edges moved in the wind, making a soft whispering sound that felt too close to speech. When I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaked in that same deliberate way. The front door opened before I knocked. Mrs. Holloway stood there as if she had been waiting behind it. She looked the same as before. Careful posture, gray hair pulled tight, hands folded. But her eyes moved over me with a kind of quick assessment that made me feel less like a worker and more like an object being checked for damage. "You came back," she said. It was not a greeting. It was a fact. "Yeah," I said, forcing my voice into something light. "I'm here." She stepped back to let me in. The cold air inside met me immediately. Not a draft, not a sudden chill. A consistent cold that made me think of shaded basements and closed doors. The house was darker than I remembered. That is what bothered me most, because it was daylight outside. Not bright sunlight, but enough. Yet inside, the lamps were on again, and the curtains were tighter, and the air itself seemed heavier, like the house had swallowed the morning and refused to give it back. I glanced toward one of the living room windows. The curtain seam was straight as a ruler. No cracks, no pinholes, nothing. Mrs. Holloway saw my glance and said nothing. She did not need to. She walked me through the same list of tasks, again with that recited calm. Kitchen, living room, hallway, laundry, never upstairs, never basement. She did not mention the warning a second time, which made it feel less like a boundary and more like something she assumed I had already learned. She sat in the kitchen again, in the same chair, in the same position. And I began to notice something about the way she placed herself in the room. It was not random. She chose a spot where she could see the hallway. Not just the hallway, the end of it, the basement door. From that chair, her line of sight ran straight down the corridor to that thick door like a gun barrel. If she turned her head slightly, she could also see the front door. If she leaned forward a fraction, she could see the living room windows. It was a perfect command position. She did not watch me clean, not directly. She watched my reflection in the dark glass of the hallway photos. She watched the spaces between rooms. She watched the places where someone could move without being fully seen. The longer I worked, the more I became aware of her attention as a physical thing. Not hostile, not paranoid, controlled. Like she was tracking the way I moved through her house without any need to follow me. I tried to break the feeling by focusing on details. The refrigerator had a slightly different rhythm today. The hum would deepen for a while, then abruptly click off. The silence afterward was louder than the hum. The HVAC vent in the floor blew air in uneven pulses, and in between those pulses, there were long gaps, long enough that I would look down at the vent and wonder if it had stopped completely. It had not. It always returned. But the pauses were strange, not natural. They felt timed, like the house was choosing when to breathe. Once I was wiping the kitchen counter and the HVAC shut off mid-cycle. The soft rush of air stopped. The refrigerator was quiet at the same moment. Even the porch light buzz seemed to fade, as if someone had cupped their hands over it. For a few seconds, there was nothing but my rag sliding over laminate and the faint sound of my own breathing. In that stretched quiet, I heard a single creak from the hallway. One isolated pressure sound, like a floorboard being tested by a careful foot. I froze with my hand still on the counter. Mrs. Holloway did not react. She did not lift her head. She did not blink. She sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes angled toward the hall. It was like she had heard it too, but hearing it did not change anything for her. The HVS kicked back on with a tired exhale. The refrigerator hummed again. The house resumed its normal mechanical life. My muscles did not. That afternoon, I made a point of moving in ways that would prove I was not being controlled by my fear. I vacuumed the living room in a different pattern. I dusted the photos on the wall and leaned close enough to see faces, men in uniforms, women in old hairstyles, a younger Mrs. Holloway with a man whose smile looked stiff. Every time I shifted my position, I noticed her eyes adjust. Not dramatically, not following me like a hawk, just recalibrating, as if she was noting where I was in relation to the hallway. At one point, I walked past her chair and pretended I was going to the bathroom. I watched her in the corner of my eye. Her head did not move, but her gaze flicked toward the corridor for half a second, then back. It was so small I could have dismissed it, except it happened every time. As if the only question she needed answered was not, "Where is he?" It was, "How close is he to the door?" By the third visit, the pattern had settled in my mind like a stain. The house was darker each time I entered it, even in daylight. The lamps were always on. The curtains were always sealed. Mrs. Holloway always placed herself in the one spot where she could monitor the hallway and the basement door without effort. And the HVAC kept pausing in long, unnatural gaps that made the quiet feel deliberate, like a trap snapping shut. I remember wiping my hands on a paper towel and thinking, with sudden clarity, that the house did not feel like a home. It felt like a controlled environment, like a place designed to remove variables, to preserve shadows, to make every sound count. And when I looked down the hallway and saw the basement door at the end, thick, swollen with paint, brass knob catching the dim lamplight, I had the uncomfortable thought that it was not the only thing being kept closed in that house. It was just the most obvious one. 2.2. The upstairs footsteps that never happen. 1,030 words. The first time I heard the upstairs footsteps, I tried not to hear them. That sounds stupid, but it is the truth. There are certain noises you can ignore if you do not give them a name, if you do not turn your head toward them, if you keep moving and let the rational part of your brain stack explanations like sandbags. Old houses settle. Heat moves through ducts. Pipes knock. Wood contracts. A raccoon gets into an attic. Wind hits a loose shutter. I told myself all of that as I vacuumed the living room and watched dust spin in the lamplight like little pale insects. Then the sound came again, and it was too human to be a pipe. Creak, creak. Slow, heavy, not stumbling, not rushing. A steady pace across the ceiling. I stopped the vacuum and stood there with my hand on the handle. The sudden silence made the house feel even bigger. The refrigerator hum was distant. The HVAC was in one of its long pauses. Somewhere outside, wind brushed the siding with a faint, dry rasp. Creak, creak. The footsteps moved from left to right, then stopped. I felt myself hold my breath. Then they moved again, right to left, back and forth, like someone walking a hallway, like someone doing it on purpose. I stared up at the ceiling as if staring hard enough would make it make sense. The living room light flickered once, not enough to go out, just enough to remind me the electricity in this place was old. I told myself it was Mrs. Holloway. That would be the normal explanation. She lived here. She was upstairs, doing whatever old people do in old houses. Maybe she was collecting something. Maybe she was checking a leak. Maybe she was restless. But the memory of her sitting in that kitchen chair, hands folded, eyes fixed down the hallway, rose in my mind like a warning. I turned toward the kitchen. Mrs. Holloway was still there. Same chair, same posture, hands folded in her lap. Face angled slightly toward the hallway, as if the basement door might suddenly open on its own. She did not look up. She did not react to the sound above us, rake, creak. The pacing continued. I walked into the kitchen quietly, keeping my voice casual on purpose. "Hey," I said. "Are you up there?" Mrs. Holloway's head turned toward me slowly. Her eyes landed on my face like a person focusing a camera lens. "No," she said. Just that. No explanation. The upstairs footsteps stopped, as if someone had paused to listen. I swallowed, forced another small laugh, and tried again. I keep hearing footsteps upstairs." Mrs. Holloway stared at me for a moment too long. Her expression did not change. "I do not go upstairs," she said flatly. I'm not upstairs right now. Not no one is upstairs. Just, I do not go upstairs. She said it like a statement of routine, like a rule she lived by, like a fact carved into the structure of her day. Then she looked away, back down the hallway, like the conversation was finished. The thing that got under my skin was not just what she said, it was the way she said it. There was no defensiveness, no irritation, no effort to convince me. It did not sound like a denial. It sounded like someone reciting a policy. For a few seconds, the house stayed still. The ceiling above us was quiet. I told myself maybe she had heard the footsteps too, and I had embarrassed her, like I was accusing her of lurking. Maybe she was sensitive about being old and having a big house she could not maintain. Maybe she simply did not like questions. Then, creak, creak. The footsteps started again, above the living room, slow and patient, crossing the ceiling with that same measured rhythm. Back and forth. Stop. Back and forth. Like someone walking the length of an upstairs hallway and turning around at the same point each time. I felt my arms go cold. Mrs. Holloway did not blink. She did not lift her head. Her hands stayed folded. But I noticed something new. A micro change so small I almost missed it. Her fingers tightened together for a moment. Not shaking. Not nervous. Tightened the way you do when you are holding yourself still. The footsteps moved closer to the area above the hallway. The creaks were sharper there, as if the floorboards were thinner or more worn. I could almost map the upstairs layout by sound alone. Creak, creak. A pause. Then another set of creaks, shorter, like someone had shifted their weight without taking a full step. It made me think of a person standing at the top of a staircase, deciding whether to come down. I forced myself to keep moving. I went back to the living room and pushed the vacuum again, letting the mechanical noise fill the space. The vacuum was loud, but it did not erase the sensation of being observed. It only made me feel like I was making myself easier to track. Every time I moved into a different room, the footsteps adjusted. When I was in the living room, they paced above the living room. When I stepped into the hallway to sweep near the photos, the pacing shifted overhead toward the center of the house. When I went into the laundry room and shut the door behind me, the footsteps stopped entirely for a full minute, as if whoever was upstairs no longer needed to move. That minute was the worst, because in that silence, all I could hear was my own breathing and the faint hum of the dryer vent. The air felt thick, like the house had swallowed sound again. Then the pacing resumed. Back and forth. Stop. Back and forth, like a person measuring. I kept thinking of my own apartment, my own neighbors, the normal upstairs noises you hear when someone drops a shoe or drags a chair. Those sounds have randomness. They have life. They have the sloppy unpredictability of people living. This did not. This was too consistent, too careful, too patient. At one point, I caught myself staring at the ceiling with my mouth slightly open, like my body had forgotten how to pretend this was normal. I walked back into the kitchen and found Mrs. Holloway still seated, still watching the hallway. The footsteps were directly overhead now, pacing above the end of the corridor, above the basement door. I do not know why I asked again. Maybe I wanted her to admit something. Maybe I wanted her to give me any explanation that would let my brain rest. "Are you sure there isn't an animal up there?" I said. Mrs. Holloway's eyes flicked toward me. Her gaze was sharp, not confused. "No," she said. Then, after a beat, she added something I will never forget. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was so small. "They do that," she said quietly. I froze. "They?" I repeated before I could stop myself. Mrs. Holloway looked at me as if I had misunderstood on purpose. "I told you what your work is," she said. "Kitchen, living room, hall, laundry." Her voice was still calm, still controlled, but the sentence landed like a correction, like she was guiding a child away from a hot stove. Upstairs, the footsteps stopped. The silence stretched. Then, right above the kitchen, directly over our heads, a single creak sounded. One sharp pressure sound, like someone had leaned forward to listen to me. Mrs. Holloway did not look up. Neither did I. I went back to vacuuming, and I did not ask another question for the rest of the day. But I kept hearing the pacing, back and forth. Stop, back and forth. And the longer it continued, the clearer one thought became in my mind, cold and unavoidable. Whatever was upstairs knew exactly where I was, and it was not trying to hide that fact. 2-3, the radio click, 1,050 words. The radio was not supposed to matter. If I had found it in a normal house, I would have thought it was cute. A dusty relic from an older decade. The kind of thing someone keeps because it belonged to a husband who is gone or because it still works if you jiggle the knob. In a normal house, a silent radio is just a silent radio. In Mrs. Holloway's house, nothing stayed just anything for long. I discovered it by accident while looking for glass cleaner. The cabinet was in the living room, a low wooden thing with doors that stuck slightly when you pulled them open. The wood smelled faintly of wax. Inside were neatly stacked linens, old coasters, a few yellowed manuals for appliances that probably did not exist anymore. And in the back, pushed against the wall like it had been hidden, was a small tabletop radio. It was black plastic with a silver face, the kind with a long horizontal dial and a thin needle that slides left to right. The surface was dusted, but not heavily, not abandoned, just not used in front of people. I lifted it out and held it in my hands. It had weight. The cord dangled, and my eyes followed it automatically. The plug was not in any outlet. In fact, the cord was wrapped and tucked neatly under the radio like someone had made sure it could not accidentally be used. I turned it over. The back panel was intact. No missing screws, no loose parts. I told myself what any sane person would. It is unplugged. It cannot make noise. I set it on the cabinet top, wiped dust rings away, and went back to cleaning. An hour later, I was in the kitchen scrubbing the sink when I heard it. A soft click. Not loud, not sharp. A little plastic sound. Like a knob turned one notch. I froze with my hands in the soapy water. The house was in one of its long, breathing pauses. The HVAC was silent. The refrigerator had clicked off. Even the porch light buzz seemed fainter, as if the dimness inside had thickened. Click. Again. It came from the direction of the living room. For a moment, I stood there with my wet hands dripping into the sink, listening. I could not hear any footsteps upstairs right then. That almost made it worse. The ceiling was quiet, which meant the sound I had heard did not have an easy distraction. I dried my hands on a paper towel and walked into the living room. The radio sat exactly where I had left it. Unplugged, cord-wrapped, dust still undisturbed. I stared at it until my eyes started to ache. I listened for anything else. Wood settling, pipes ticking, the tiny sounds of a house being a house. Nothing came. I reached out and touched the radio lightly, half expecting it to be warm, half expecting it to be vibrating. It was cold. I laughed under my breath, a quick, forced sound that had no humor in it. "Okay," I murmured. "Okay." I kept cleaning, and I tried not to let that click take up space in my mind. But once you hear a sound that does not belong, it becomes a reference point. Everything else starts organizing itself around it. A little later, I was sweeping near the hallway again. I had sprinkled a small amount of flour on a damp spot near the pantry earlier, an old trick my mom used to do to help scrub sticky floors. When it dried, it left a pale dust line that made it easy to see where my broom had already been. It was a thin, faint stripe across the wood, almost invisible unless you knew it was there. I remember noticing it because the flour looked too bright in the dim hallway, like a chalk line at a crime scene. As I swept, I heard the radio click again. This time, it did not come from the living room. It came from the end of the hallway, from the direction of the basement door. The sound was small, precise, and impossibly located, as if someone stood behind that thick painted wood and turned a dial once, gently, just to prove they could. My broom stopped moving. The hair on my arms rose in a wave. I did not look down the hallway immediately. I kept my eyes on the floor because that felt safer, as if meeting the door's presence directly would turn a vague fear into a real confrontation. Mrs. Holloway sat in her kitchen chair, her face angled toward the hall. Her hands were folded. Her expression was calm, almost absent, but I saw her throat move in a swallow, slow and careful, like she was keeping her body quiet. "Do you hear that?" I asked, hating that my voice sounded thin. Mrs. Holloway did not turn her head. She did not ask what I meant. "No," she said. The word was too quick, too practiced. I stared at her for a moment, waiting for her to soften it with an explanation. She did not, so I did what I had been doing since the first day. I returned to my work because work was the only thing that made sense. I carried the broom into the laundry room. The laundry room was a small square of space off the kitchen, the kind of room that feels like it was added as an afterthought. It had a washer, a dryer, and a single bare bulb that flickered slightly when it was on. The door to the laundry room shut with a dull thud, and the sound seemed to seal me away from the rest of the house. That should have been comforting. It was not. In the laundry room, the house sounds changed. The hallway became muffled. The refrigerator hum felt farther away. My own breathing sounded louder. I wiped the top of the washer, cleaned the lint trap, folded a few towels that were stiff like they had been washed too hot. I was standing at the sink in the laundry room, small, shallow, metal, when the HVAC stopped again. Mid-cycle, mid-breath. The sudden silence made my muscles tighten, and then I heard something else. Not a click this time, A low, dull shift, like a heavy object had moved behind a barrier, like something had dragged itself across concrete with a careful, controlled motion. It was faint, but it had weight in it. I held still, one hand hovering over the laundry sink faucet. I waited for the sound to repeat. It did not. The HVAC started again with a tired exhale. The world resumed. I told myself I had imagined it. I told myself that because I did not want another explanation. When I finished in the laundry room, I opened the door and stepped back into the kitchen. Mrs. Holloway was in the same chair, same posture, same folded hands. She looked up at me as if she had been expecting me to emerge at that exact moment. I took the broom and walked toward the hallway, mostly because I could not stop myself. Some part of me needed to confirm that the house was still the same shape, that the hallway had not rearranged itself while I was hidden away folding towels. I reached the pale dust line on the floor, and my stomach dropped. The flower line I had swept earlier was disturbed, not smeared by my shoes, not scattered by the broom. It looked like something heavy had pressed near the base of the basement door and shifted slightly, like a weight had rolled or dragged just enough to break the clean edge of the dust. A gentle scuff, right at the line, perfectly placed, perfectly timed. It was the kind of mark you would never notice in a normal house, the kind of thing your brain filters out. But I saw it immediately because I had made the line, and because the house had trained me to measure every small change. I stood there staring at the scuff until my eyes started to water from not blinking. Then I forced myself to move. I swept it up. I cleaned it away like it never existed, like I could erase the evidence by erasing the dust. When I went back to the kitchen, Mrs. Holloway was standing now, holding an envelope in her hands. She walked toward me without hurrying and extended it. Inside was cash, neatly folded, exact bills, not crumpled, not random, prepared. "Your pay," she said. I took it, my fingers brushing the paper. The envelope felt warm, like she had been holding it a long time. I cleared my throat, trying to gather the courage to say I would not be back. But before I could, she spoke again. "You will sleep here Friday," Mrs. Holloway said. Not a question, not an invitation, a schedule. I stared at her. What? Her eyes stayed on mine, calm, unblinking. "You will," she repeated, as if I had not heard the words clearly the first time. "One night. It is better that way." Better for who? The thought formed in my head, sharp and immediate, but I did not ask it aloud. I did not trust what the answer might sound like in her flat, rehearsed voice. I looked down at the envelope in my hand, at the money I needed, at the clean folds that suggested this had been planned before I arrived. Behind me, somewhere in the living room, the unplugged radio clicked once, soft, precise, like someone confirming a decision had been made. 3.1, the first quiet, 1,080 words. By Friday, the idea of sleeping in her house had grown in my mind like mold. It started as a sentence, "You will sleep here Friday," and then it became the thing I carried around all week, tucked behind my normal thoughts. I would be stocking shelves at the convenience store, listening to the overhead freezer fan whine, and suddenly I would remember the way Mrs. Holloway's eyes stayed open too long when she spoke. I would be driving home on roads lit by strip mall signs and brake lights, and I would catch the faint, damp earth smell in my jacket and feel my stomach tighten. I tried to talk myself out of it. I told myself I could call her and cancel. I told myself I could ignore her number. I told myself no amount of cash was worth making my skin crawl. Then rent came due. Gas went up. My bank app showed a number that felt like a joke. So on Friday afternoon, I packed an overnight bag, and drove out there like I was driving toward a decision I had already made for myself. The sky was flat and gray, stretched tight over the fields. Wind moved through the bare trees along the county road, and it made a sound like static, dry branches brushing each other in quick, nervous whispers. The kind of wind that always seems to carry a little grit in it, like it has been dragging itself across cold dirt all day. I passed the Dollar General, the gas station with the harsh neon, the same places that looked normal enough to make you feel ridiculous for being afraid of an old woman's house. I considered stopping for coffee just to have something warm in my hands. I did not. I kept going. By the time I turned into her gravel driveway, it felt like the world had dimmed another shade. The porch light was on again, buzzing faintly, even though it was not yet dark. The tall grass along the driveway edge bowed and rose in the wind, like something breathing in the ground. Her mailbox leaned the same way it always did, rusted and tired, like it had been hit once and never quite recovered. I parked, grabbed my bag, and sat for a moment with my door open, letting the wind slap cold air into the car. I listened to the engine tick as it cooled. I listened for anything else. The property was quiet, not peaceful. Quiet in a way that made every sound count. When I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaked under my weight in that same deliberate rhythm. The front door opened before I knocked. Mrs. Holloway stood there like she had been watching through the peephole, even though I never saw a peephole on that door. She wore a dark cardigan and a long skirt that made her look older than she already was, like she belonged to a different decade. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her hands were folded at her waist. She looked past me immediately, toward my car, toward the driveway, toward the road beyond. "You came," she said. I forced a small smile. "Yeah." She stepped aside to let me in. The cold inside the house hit me as soon as I crossed the threshold. Not drafty cold, stored cold, the kind that lives in the walls. She closed the door with care and checked the latch with a small tug, as if she needed to feel it hold. "My room is upstairs," she said, already turning away. "Yours is downstairs." Of course it was. She led me down the dim hallway again. The framed photos on the walls reflected the weak lamp glow instead of showing faces. The basement door waited at the end like it always did, thick and painted and wrong. I kept my eyes off it on purpose. The guest room was on the first floor, set back from the main spaces as if it was meant to isolate whoever slept there. It smelled faintly of old fabric and something earthy underneath, like damp soil that had dried into wood and never fully left. The bed was narrow and sat too low, the mattress slightly sunken in the middle. A thin blanket lay folded at the foot, the kind that feels scratchy against skin no matter how many times it has been washed. There was a small dresser with one drawer half stuck, and a lamp on the nightstand, with a shade that leaned a little to the left. The window was covered with curtains, of course. Heavy fabric pulled tight, sealing the room off from whatever light or view existed outside. I noticed the vent in the floor immediately. It was larger than normal, the metal grate scratched and worn. When the HVAC kicked on, it did not just blow air. It seemed to exhale, a long, loud breath that filled the room, then stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt too complete. Mrs. Holloway stood in the doorway while I set my bag down. She did not step inside. She did not look at the bed. Her eyes stayed on my hands as if she cared more about what I carried than where I slept. "Bathroom is at the end of the hall," she said. "Do not open any other doors." It took me a second to realize she meant it the way she meant everything, as an instruction, not a suggestion. I nodded. "Okay." She looked at me for another beat. then turned away without another word. The first hours of the evening passed in a way that should have been normal if the house itself had not been so determined to feel wrong. Mrs. Holloway did not offer dinner. She did not ask if I was hungry. She moved around the kitchen quietly, and I heard the soft clink of a spoon against ceramic, then nothing. When I finally wandered out, I saw her sitting at the small kitchen table with a single bowl in front of her, eating so slowly it barely counted as eating. The light in the kitchen came from 2 candles in glass holders, not from the ceiling fixture. Their flames trembled every time the HVAC cycled, shadows crawling across the cabinets like fingers. No TV played in the background, no radio, no phone ringing, just the house. The refrigerator hummed, deep and steady, then clicked off with a final heavy shudder. The floor creaked when I shifted my weight. Somewhere above us, the upstairs ceiling gave a faint tick, like wood settling into place. Outside, wind pushed against the siding. The trees responded with that static whisper, branches rubbing against each other, restless. I sat across from Mrs. Holloway with my hands around a mug of lukewarm tea she had poured, without asking what I wanted. The tea tasted like weak chamomile, or maybe something cheaper. My mouth felt dry anyway. I tried to make small talk, mostly to prove to myself I could. "So, how long have you lived here?" I asked. Mrs. Holloway kept her eyes on her bowl. "A long time." "Do you have family around?" I tried. Her spoon stopped for a moment, then continued. "No," she said. The word was clean and final. Silence settled between us. Candlelight flickered. The fridge kicked on again, that low mechanical life returning like a heartbeat. The HVAC turned on, and the vent in the floor exhaled loudly enough that I flinched before I could stop myself. Mrs. Holloway did not react. She ate another spoonful, then another, and when she finished, she rinsed her bowl and set it in the dish rack with 2 other plates. Exactly 3. Always 3. At some point she stood and said, "Good night," like it was another rehearsed line. I watched her walk toward the staircase, her footsteps careful on the creaking wood. Halfway up, she paused. I could not see her face from where I sat, only her silhouette against the dim upper landing. She said, without turning back, "Lock your door." My chest tightened. "It locks?" She answered like she had not heard the question. "Lock it." Then she continued upstairs and disappeared. I sat there alone in the candlelit kitchen with the house breathing around me. For a few minutes, I let myself believe the tension was only awkwardness, that I was sleeping in a stranger's old house, that the quiet was just the quiet of someone who did not own a television, that the darkness was just a preference, that the weirdness in my head was just my own imagination trying to make a story out of nothing. I took my overnight bag and went into the guest room. The door did have a lock, a small bolt on the inside, newer than the rest of the hardware, shiny like it was used often. I slid it into place and listened to the click. It sounded too loud. I turned off the lamp and lay down on the bed. The mattress sagged. The thin blanket scratched my skin through my shirt. The air from the vent breathed in long cycles, loud enough to keep me awake. In the darkness, I could smell the faint earthiness again, stronger now that my face was close to the pillow. I stared at the ceiling and tried to let my mind drift. Then, somewhere far off in the house, the refrigerator clicked off mid-hum. The HVAC followed a beat later, and in the sudden, unnatural quiet, so complete it felt like the house had swallowed its own breath, I heard something from below the floor, a soft scrape, slow, careful, like a chair leg being dragged across concrete. And the first thing that flashed through my mind was not the basement. It was Mrs. Holloway's voice, calm and unblinking, as if she had been preparing me for this all week. It is better that way. 3.2. The knob turn. 1,050 words. I did not sleep. I lay there with my eyes open, staring into a darkness that felt too thick to be normal. The guest room smelled like old fabric and that faint, underground dampness that had followed me since the first day. The thin blanket scratched the side of my neck whenever I shifted. The mattress sagged under my hips like it had already decided what shape I would be for the night. The vent in the floor breathed loud enough to count. On, off, on. Each cycle filled the room with that dry, warmed air and then let it die away, leaving the silence behind it sharper than before. I tried to ride the rhythm the way people ride white noise to sleep. I tried to tell myself it was just an old furnace and a too-wide vent. But the scrape I had heard in the hush, the careful drag like a chair leg moving on concrete, had not left my head. It sat there as a question I could not stop asking. What would be dragging a chair in a basement in the middle of the night? I told myself it could have been a pipe. It could have been a duct shifting. It could have been my own imagination playing tricks, because the house was too quiet and I had let myself get worked up. Then the refrigerator kicked on again in the kitchen, a deep mechanical hum that made me feel briefly, stupidly relieved. Noise means life. Noise means normal. I watched the outline of the curtains in the dark. The fabric barely moved, but sometimes the wind outside made it tremble in a way that looked like breath. At some point, I checked my phone screen under the blanket. The light stabbed my eyes. The time was just after midnight. The bars were low. Service out here was weak. I set the phone down again and stared at the ceiling until my eyes started to sting. That was when I heard the hallway. Not footsteps at first. Not a voice, just a single creak in the wood outside my room, subtle enough that I could have mistaken it for the house settling if it had not sounded so placed. Creak. Then another, farther down the hallway. Creak, creak. Slow, deliberate. The sound of weight being shifted carefully, not the clumsy shuffle of an old woman half asleep. It did not have the randomness of someone going to the bathroom. It had intention. My hands went cold under the blanket. I listened hard, holding myself still in case the movement of my body made the bed creak. The footsteps, if that is what they were, moved closer in a steady line. Each board complained softly, like the house did not want to keep secrets. Creak, creak, closer. I could almost picture the exact spots where the boards would be worst. The small hollow in the floor near the bathroom, the older plank near the photo table, the slight dip by the end of the hallway. It was like the footsteps knew where not to step. Then they stopped. Right outside my door. There was no sound for a moment. No breathing. No shifting weight. Just the heavy stillness of someone standing close enough that the air changes. Close enough that your body senses a presence, even when your mind wants to deny it. I stared at the darkness where the door was, my eyes straining to make a shape out of nothing. Silence stretched. The HVAC was running, a low rush through the vent, loud enough to make me question whether I was imagining the quiet in the hallway. Then, in the middle of that rushing air, I heard the smallest sound a human can make that still feels like a threat. A faint scrape of fabric, like a sleeve brushing the doorframe. Then the doorknob moved. Not a hard twist, not a violent jiggle. It turned slowly, carefully, as if whoever was on the other side wanted to know exactly how far it would go. Testing the mechanism, measuring the resistance. The latch did not click. The door did not open because I had locked it. The knowledge hit me in a way that made my throat tighten. If it had not been for Mrs. Holloway's quiet instruction, lock your door, that knob would have turned and the door would have opened, and whatever stood there would have been inside my room. My body reacted before my brain could keep up. I grabbed the sheet and pulled it up to my chin like a child. The movement felt pathetic the second it happened, and I hated myself for it. I hated that fear could reduce me to something so small, but I did not put the sheet back down. I held it there and tried to breathe quietly through my nose, trying not to make any sound that would confirm I was awake. The doorknob stayed turned for a long moment, not shaking, not forcing, just held, like the hand on the other side was patient, like it had time. My eyes stung from not blinking. Then, very slowly, the knob eased back into place. The metal made a soft, almost polite sound against the latch. The pressure on the other side of the door changed. I felt it the way you feel a person step back from you in a small room. The footsteps resumed. Creak, creak. Moving away down the hallway. The same measured pace. Not hurried, not panicked, not annoyed. Just finished. I lay there frozen long after the sounds faded, listening for the next thing. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I waited for my hands to stop shaking. I waited for the vent to stop sounding like someone breathing through a wall. And then, when I was just beginning to believe the worst moment had passed, the house took a breath in a way that felt wrong. The HVAC cut off mid-cycle. The rush of air stopped instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. In the same beat, the refrigerator hum in the kitchen died. The world inside the house did not become merely quiet. It became blank. The kind of silence that feels engineered, mechanical, like a power outage that only affects sound. For one heavy second, there was nothing. No wind in the trees, no house settling, no distant road noise, not even the faint buzz of the porch light. In that perfect hush, my ears strained the way they do in a dark room when you think something is moving nearby. And from below the floor, beneath the boards, beneath the vent, beneath whatever crawl space or foundation separated me from the basement, I heard it again. A tiny scrape, not a random scuff, a controlled drag slow enough to have purpose, light enough to be careful. Like a chair leg moving on concrete. The sound was so small it should have been dismissible, and yet it felt enormous in my nerves because it came in that unnatural silence, framed like a message. Then the HVAC kicked back on with a dry exhale, and the refrigerator hummed again, and the house returned to its normal mechanical life as if nothing had happened. But I lay there with my sheet pulled up to my chin, staring into the dark, thinking about the doorknob, thinking about the patience in the way it had turned, and thinking about the way the house itself seemed to go quiet right after, like it wanted to make sure I heard what moved below, as if the sound was not an accident, as if it was the point. 3.3. The basement door, 1,050 words. After the knob turned, time stopped behaving like time. Minutes stretched until they felt like hours. The air from the vent kept cycling, but every time it shut off and came back on, I flinched like I was being conditioned. My body stayed locked in that half-curled position, sheet up to my chin, eyes fixed on the dark shape of the door. I told myself I would get up when the sun came up. I told myself I would leave at first light and never come back. Then I heard the basement door. At first, it was so faint I thought I had imagined it. A low, drawn-out groan of wood and metal, like an old hinge waking up. But it continued, long enough to be unmistakable. A slow hinge groan, followed by the sharp, clean sound of hardware shifting. Click. The latch, the basement door opening. The sound did not come from right outside my room. It came from the end of the hallway, distant but clear in a house with no other noise. It carried through the dark like a signal flare. I lay perfectly still and listened, waiting for footsteps to follow. Someone walking down the hall, someone moving downstairs, someone doing anything that would make this fit into a normal pattern. No footsteps came. Instead, there was that scrape again. Not the creak of stairs, not the shuffle of shoes. A soft, deliberate drag, like a chair leg moving on concrete. Once, then a pause, then again, slightly longer, like the object being moved needed a careful adjustment. I felt my mouth go dry. The sound was below me, not above. It lived under the floorboards, under the vent, under whatever layers of wood and empty space separated my guest room from the basement. If it was a pipe, it was the most intentional pipe in the world. If it was the house settling, it was settling like a person. I listened so hard my ears hurt. I imagined the basement in my mind because my mind insisted on filling in the space. A concrete floor, a single bulb hanging, a chair being dragged into position. Someone arranging something in the dark. The scrape stopped. Silence returned, thick and waiting. Then came the long pause. Not 2 seconds, not 10. A full stretch of time where nothing moved, nothing breathed, and my nerves had nowhere to go. I do not know how long it lasted. It could have been 1 minute. It could have been 5. In the dark, with the sheet held tight in my fist and my heart thudding, it felt endless. Finally, another sound rose from the hallway. Footsteps, but not the ones from before. These were heavier, slower, more confident. Creak, creak. Each step pressed into the old wood with enough weight to make the boards complain. The pattern did not wander like someone half asleep. It came straight down the hall, direct, as if whoever was walking knew exactly where they were going. Toward my door. I held my breath, trying to make myself smaller, trying to make the bed stop being a thing that could betray me with a squeak. The footsteps stopped outside my room. Silence again. Then the lock on my door clicked. Not the bolt from inside. That stayed in place. This was the other kind of click, subtle and close, like a fingernail brushing metal, like someone testing the edge of the latch. The doorknob turned slowly again. This time it did not stop at testing. It turned with steady pressure. The latch gave, and the door moved. Only a crack, because the bolt held from the inside. The door opened just enough to let a thin blade of hallway light cut into my room. The light fell across the floor and climbed the edge of the bed like a warning line. A shape filled the gap. I could not see a face. The hallway was dim, and whoever stood there kept their head back, so the light behind them did not reveal much. But I saw the outline of shoulders. I saw the bulk of a body that was not small and not frail. The air felt like it tightened. I kept my eyes open, staring at the crack, because looking away felt like surrender. For a moment, the shape did not move. It simply stood there, occupying the gap, blocking the hallway light like a person blocking a doorway at a party when you are trying to leave. Then something lowered into the crack, just a hand near the level of the knob. In that thin slice of light, I saw what the hand was holding. A strap or a cord. Thin, dark, looped over the fingers like a tool. Not a belt, not a rope thick enough for dramatic movie nonsense. Something practical, something you could use one-handed, something you would bring if you intended to restrain something that might struggle, or if you intended to carry something heavy without hurting your hands. The sight made my stomach drop in a clean, cold way. I had been telling myself stories all week. Animals in the attic, pipes in the walls, an old woman with strange preferences. A strap is not a preference. A strap is preparation. The hand shifted slightly, and the strap swung with it in a small arc. The movement was almost casual, like someone waiting their turn at a counter. I realized, in that moment, that whoever stood outside my door had no urgency. They were not rushing. They were not panicking. They were not improvising. They were checking a routine. The shape leaned closer to the crack, and I caught a faint sound, so soft it barely made it through the gap. Not a voice, a breath, slow and controlled, like someone trying to listen. I forced myself to keep still, to keep my breathing shallow, to keep my sheet up like a shield, even though it did nothing. The strap moved again, just a little, and the hand rose as if it might reach for the bolt from the inside, as if the person had some way to undo it, as if they had done this before. Then, abruptly, the hand withdrew. The shape held still for another beat, as if reconsidering, and then the door eased shut, not slammed, not shoved, closed carefully, silently, like whoever was out there respected the house. The doorknob turned back into place with the same gentle precision. The footsteps moved away down the hallway, the boards creaking under that same confident weight. Creak, creak, fading. I did not move for a long time after that. My muscles locked so tight they started to ache. My mouth tasted metallic. My heartbeat felt like it was shaking the mattress. When the house finally resumed its normal mechanical noise, the refrigerator humming, the HVAC breathing, I lay there staring at the dark, thinking about the strap, and thinking about the fact that it had been held in a hand like it belonged there, like it was part of the house's nightly tools. The worst part was not that my door had opened. The worst part was the ease of it, the calm, the confidence. I lay there until my eyes burned, and then something in me shifted. Not courage, not bravery. Just the blunt refusal to keep imagining what was happening without knowing. If I stayed in that bed until morning, I would spend every second listening for the next creak, the next knob turn, the next scrape from below. I would become a person trapped inside my own fear, and whoever was moving through that house would know it. I thought of the name tag imprint in the hallway drawer. Do not go down. It did not feel like a warning anymore. It felt like a challenge someone had already lost. I sat up slowly. The bed creaked, loud in the quiet, and I winced. I swung my feet to the floor and felt the cold boards through my socks. I stared at the door. My hands were shaking, but I reached for my phone anyway. The screen light spilled across the sheets. No signal. 2% battery. Useless. I set it down. I picked up the baseball bat I had leaned against the nightstand earlier, the cheap aluminum cold in my grip, and in the darkness of that guest room, with the house breathing around me like it was alive, I made a decision that felt both insane and inevitable. I could not stay blind. I was going down. 4-1. The descent, 160 words. I stood in the guest room for a full minute with the bat in my hand, staring at the door like it might open on its own again. My hands were shaking in that frustrating, useless way, where you are furious at your own body for betraying you. The aluminum felt too light to be reassuring. The room was still dark, the air still carrying that faint earth smell that did not belong in any bedroom. The vent in the floor breathed once, long and loud, and then stopped, leaving the silence behind it like a trap waiting to close. I told myself I could stay in the room. I told myself I could sit on the bed and wait until morning and leave without ever knowing. Then I remembered the strap hanging from those fingers in the crack of my doorway. I imagined that hand returning, patient and practiced, and I felt something harden in me. Not bravery, just refusal. I opened my door slowly. The hallway beyond was dim, lit by the same weak lamp on the side table. The framed photos on the wall reflected a thin smear of light, turning faces into dark, floating shapes. The air out here felt colder than the guest room, as if the corridor acted like a funnel for whatever the house kept hidden. I stepped out and pulled the door almost closed behind me, not clicking the latch, not wanting the sound. My socks slid slightly on the polished wood. I paused and listened. Nothing moved upstairs, no pacing, no creaks above. The silence felt unnatural now, like an animal holding still when it knows you are looking for it. The kitchen was dark, except for the faint glow that leaked under a doorway. I did not see candlelight. I did not hear dishes. Mrs. Holloway's presence was nowhere obvious, which only made the house feel more occupied in the ways that mattered. I took one step. The floorboard creaked under my weight with a slow complaint. It was not loud, but in a house like this, loud was not necessary. The sound traveled. It announced me. I moved again, placing my feet carefully, trying to step on the parts of the boards that felt more supported. It did not matter. The house found a way to speak under me anyway. Creak, creak. Every sound felt like I was signing my name on paper I could not read. At the end of the hallway, the basement door waited. In the dim lamplight, the paint looked thick and uneven, layered over itself like it had been applied in a hurry. The brass knob held a dull shine. Above it, the newer latch gleamed with a clean, modern edge that made it look even more out of place. My throat tightened as I got closer. I could feel my pulse in my wrists around the bat. I expected the latch to be locked. I expected some resistance. I expected to have to make a choice with my hands that would leave evidence. Bent metal, a scuffed door frame, a noise that would wake the house. I reached up slowly and touched the latch. It was already set in the open position, not hanging loose, not broken. Set, like someone had unlatched it and left it ready. My hand froze on the cool metal. For a second, I stood there staring at that simple fact, letting it sink in. The door was not locked because it was not meant to keep people out. It was meant to test whether people would go in. I slid my fingers around the knob. The brass was cold enough to sting slightly. I held it for a moment, listening for any movement upstairs, listening for the refrigerator hum, the HVAC breath, the faint buzz of the porch light. The house gave me almost nothing. Then I turned the knob. The door opened with a reluctant, heavy motion, like it had weight beyond wood and paint. The hinge groaned softly, a long, strained sound that felt like waking something up. The air that rose from behind the door hit me immediately. Damp earth, cold wood, and something faint and metallic underneath. Subtle, like pennies in a pocket. Like old tools left too long in a humid room. The smell made my stomach tighten because it confirmed what my brain had been trying not to accept all week. This was not just a basement smell. It was a lived-in smell. A sealed-in smell, like air that had been held and recycled and never properly released. I angled the bat into my left hand and raised my phone in my right, the flashlight already on. The beam was thin and harsh, cutting through the darkness like a blade. It landed on the top stair. The basement stairs were wooden and steep, descending into a black that seemed to drink the light. The first step looked worn down in the center, as if many feet had pressed it there. The railing was thick, the wood polished smooth by years of hands. I took a breath and stepped onto the first stair. Creak. The board groaned under me, long and loud enough that I felt my face heat with panic. The sound traveled up the hallway behind me. It felt like it reached upstairs. It felt like it reached everything. I froze, waiting for an answer. No footsteps, no voice, no movement, just the lingering echo of my own decision. I stepped down again. Creak. The stair complained like it was trying to warn me. My phone light shook with my hand. I tightened my grip until my knuckles hurt, furious at the tremor. Halfway down, I paused and looked back. The hallway behind me was still there, dim and ordinary. The lamp's glow spilled into the stairwell in a weak triangle. The basement door was open, and beyond it the framed photos on the wall caught the light in their glass, turning into dark mirrors. For a second, I thought I saw movement in one of those reflections, something shifting near the kitchen doorway. I blinked hard. The reflection stayed the same. Nothing moved. That did not calm me. It made the fear sharper, because now I could not trust my eyes either. I turned back toward the darkness below. The air grew colder with each step. The damp smell intensified. The metallic note became slightly clearer, like the basement had its own flavor that you could taste on your tongue if you breathed deep enough. The stairs creaked under me one by one, a slow cascade of sound. It felt like I was being recorded by the house itself, like each creak was a mark, like the floorboards were making a timeline of my descent. Near the bottom, the temperature dropped again. I felt it on my cheeks, on my hands. The air was thicker down here, heavier, as if it held more moisture than it should. I reached the last step. The flashlight beam stretched out into the basement space and caught the edge of something wooden. A shelf, maybe. A support beam. The light did not reach far enough to show the whole room. I hesitated with one foot on the final stair. In that moment, the house above me felt impossibly far away, as if I had already stepped into a different building. I could no longer hear the refrigerator hum. I could no longer hear the porch light buzz. The only sound was my own breath and the faint settling of wood around me. Then, from somewhere deeper in the basement, so soft I almost missed it, came a sound that made my stomach flip. A tiny scrape, not the creak of my stairs, not the shift of the house. A controlled drag across a hard surface, like a chair leg moving on concrete. My flashlight beam jerked in that direction, slicing across darkness, catching nothing but air. I swallowed hard and forced my foot down onto the basement floor. The concrete under my sock was cold enough to shock me, and as I stepped off the last stair, fully committing my weight to the basement, I understood something with a sick, sudden clarity. The house had been quiet upstairs because the important part of the house was down here, and whatever had been testing my door was not finished with me. It had been guiding me. 4.2. The chair in the center, 1,080 words. At the bottom of the stairs, I found the light switch on the wall with my fingertips before I found it with my eyes. The concrete under my socks was so cold it felt wet. The air pressed against my face, thick with dampness and that faint metallic smell. My flashlight beam bounced in short, nervous arcs across the basement. catching corners of shelves and shadowed shapes that refused to become clear. The switch plate was old plastic, slightly loose. When I flipped it up, nothing happened. For a split second, I stood there with my heart hammering, convinced the basement wanted to stay dark. Then, after a delay long enough to feel intentional, the single overhead bulb flickered. Once. Twice. And then it came on with a weak yellow glow that did not brighten the room so much as reveal that the room had been waiting. I breathed out and immediately regretted it. Because now I could see. And the basement did not look like storage. It did not look like a place where someone tossed old paint cans and Christmas decorations and broken chairs. It looked arranged, cleared, maintained. Too clean for an old house. Not the clean of fresh paint or organized shelves. The clean of absence. The clean of a room that has had everything unnecessary removed so only the essentials remain. The concrete floor was bare. No clutter. No spiderwebs strung carelessly across corners. No stacks of boxes that leaned at odd angles. Even the dust. There was dust, but it was fine and even, like a thin layer that had settled and then been left alone, undisturbed by casual living. The shelves along the walls held a few items, but they were spaced out like props. A couple of clear storage bins with lids, a folded tarp, a toolbox that looked newer than it should have, a stack of rags, nothing chaotic. The normal messiness that would have made me feel safer was missing. My flashlight was still on in my hand, and the beam looked ridiculous now, jittering across a room that did not need it. The overhead bulb cast a weak circle of light, and everything outside that circle faded into shadows that felt deliberate, like they had been measured. I took one step forward. The sound of my sock on concrete was soft. Too soft. The basement swallowed it. I took another. And then I saw it. In the center of the room, perfectly placed beneath the hanging bulb, was a single chair. It was not an old chair from the house. It was a basic folding chair. Metal legs, plastic seat. Something you could buy at a big box store. Something practical. Something that did not belong to the aesthetic of an old wooden home. It sat alone on the bare concrete like it was the point of the room. On the chair's seat, facing the staircase where I had just come down, was a small device. At first glance, it looked like a cheap camera. Then my brain registered what it actually was. A baby monitor. The old kind. A small unit with a dark screen and buttons worn shiny by fingers. A camera piece attached with a strip of tape, angled upward, aimed directly at the stairs. A cold, simple thought moved through me. This is not for babies. The device was off, or at least the screen was dark, but it was positioned with care. The lens pointed to the exact spot where a person's face would be as they stepped off the last stair. The angle was low, like the low angles in those Polaroids I had not seen yet, like the low angles that make people look unaware and vulnerable. I stared at the chair and felt a slow heaviness settle in my chest. The basement had been quiet because it had been watching. My eyes traveled past the chair toward the wall behind it, and then I saw the corkboard. It was mounted at eye level, centered like a display. The cork looked newer than the basement around it. Clean edges, fresh pushpins. It looked like something put up recently, or at least maintained enough to survive time. Pinned to it were photographs, Polaroids, dozens of them. They were arranged in rows, not perfectly aligned but intentionally grouped. The images were dim and grainy, taken in low light, but I recognized the settings immediately because I had just been in them. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway. Shots taken from low angles, near the floor, behind furniture, from the shadow line beneath a table. The kind of angle you get if a camera is placed low and left alone, or if someone crouches and shoots without being noticed. People were in the photos. Not one or two. Many. A man standing by the kitchen counter with his back turned, holding a mug. A woman bending to tie her shoe near the front door. A young guy, maybe my age, vacuuming the living room, his face turned slightly away as if he did not know he was being watched. None of them were posing. None of them were looking at the camera. They looked unaware, ordinary, captured mid-motion like wildlife in a trap camera photo. My stomach rolled. I took another step toward the board, then stopped because the closer I got, the more the photos became real. In one, someone sat in the same kitchen chair Mrs. Holloway used, except the person was not her. In another, a person stood near the basement door, their hand hovering over the knob in that cautious way I recognized from my own body. In another, a man slept on the guest room bed, turned slightly toward the door, face half buried in the pillow, the blanket pulled up. The most disturbing thing was not anything violent. There was no blood, no bodies, no obvious crime scene. It was the routine. It looked like a collection, like a record, like proof that this had happened enough times to be categorized. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. The overhead bulb flickered once, dimming, and the shadows in the room stretched and shifted. For half a second, the chair looked like it was moving, like it was leaning forward. It was not. It was just my nerves. I forced myself to breathe through my nose, slow and quiet, because suddenly the air in the basement felt like it belonged to someone else. Like if I breathed too loudly, it would be heard. I looked down at the baby monitor on the chair. The buttons were worn. One corner had a crack. A strip of tape held the camera unit in place like someone had fixed it with urgency and then never bothered to make it neat. My hands wanted to reach out, to pick it up, to see if it was running, to see if it had recorded me coming down the stairs. But my body did not move, because I had the strange sensation that touching it would cross a line I could not uncross. Like the basement wanted me to interact with it. Like the chair and the monitor were waiting for that. My gaze returned to the corkboard, scanning the faces. Most were blurred. Shadows, side profiles, people caught in mid-motion. The photos did not show violence, but they implied possibility. They implied that the act of watching was the real point, and everything else was secondary. Then I noticed something else. Some of the Polaroids had small marks near them. A tiny dot in the corner. A pencil line. A faint smudge as if someone had touched the same photo repeatedly. Patterns, groupings, not random souvenirs, data, a system. The thought I had been avoiding all week finally landed in full weight. Mrs. Holloway was not just an old woman who liked her curtains closed. This house was not just old, it was curated, built around rules, built around observation. And the basement was not storage. It was a control room made to look humble. I turned my head slightly, and the overhead bulb's weak light caught the glossy surface of one Polaroid near the bottom row. The image was darker than the rest, but I could make out a figure in the kitchen. Someone at the counter, shoulders tense, head slightly bowed. For a second, my brain did not recognize the shape. Then it did. The jacket, the posture, the way I always stand when I am scrubbing a sink too hard. It was me, taken from low angle, from somewhere near the floor, while I had been working earlier that week. I stared at my own back on that small square of film, and a cold understanding settled into my bones. I had not come into the basement to discover what was hidden. I had come into the basement to join the board, and somewhere above me, in the dark house that refused daylight, a floorboard creaked softly, as if in response. 4.3. The names without names, 1,080 words. After I saw myself on the board, my brain tried to protect me by narrowing the world. It did that thing it does when something is too big, shrinking everything down to details, to objects, to little solvable facts. My eyes stopped being able to hold the whole basement at once. They bounced from the chair to the monitor to the edges of the corkboard, as if I could find a single missing piece that would turn the situation back into something explainable. I forced myself closer. The concrete floor swallowed my steps. The overhead bulb hummed faintly, a sound I had not noticed until I started listening for everything. The baby monitor sat on the chair like an accusation, its dark screen reflecting a tiny, warped version of my face. On the corkboard, I looked again at the Polaroids, not as images, but as evidence. And that was when I noticed the sticky notes. Some of the photos had small yellow squares stuck beneath them, the corners curled slightly. The handwriting was blocky and impatient, as if whoever wrote it did not care about neatness, only clarity. Delivery, girl with braids. Tall one, laundry guy. The labels were not names. They were categories, the kind of categories you use when you do not care who someone is, only what kind of person they are, what kind of role they play when they enter a space. My mouth went dry. I scanned the board, seeing the system more clearly now. Photos grouped by label. Multiple delivery shots. Different people, similar moments. Hands full of boxes, faces turned away, bodies half in frame as they stepped inside. Girl with braids showed the same woman more than once, like she had returned or stayed longer. Tall one was a man in a hoodie, his head nearly brushing a doorway. And then, beneath a darker photo taken low from near the kitchen baseboards, I saw a sticky note with a word that made my stomach clench. Returned. I stared at it until my eyes watered. Returned meant someone came back. Returned meant the house did not always let things end cleanly. My gaze drifted away from the board to the wall beside it, and I noticed something else I had missed, because it was so subtle and so ugly in its simplicity. A section of the basement wall was covered in pencil marks, tally lines, not decoration, not doodles. Straight vertical strokes grouped in fives, scratched into the painted surface like a prisoner marking days. The pencil marks were faint in some places, darker in others, as if they had been added over time in different hands or different moods. Some groups were neat, some were sloppy, some had been partially erased and redrawn. It was not a calendar. It was not a to-do list. It was counting. Counting what? Days, people, attempts, nights. My mind tried to connect it to the way Mrs. Holloway crossed out days on her kitchen calendar in tight, straight lines. The same need for order, the same insistence on tracking time. Only down here the tracking felt predatory. I looked back at the board and found myself again without wanting to. The photo of my back in the kitchen felt like it was burning through the cork. I leaned closer, and my flashlight beam shook as it crossed the image. The angle was low, almost floor level, like the camera had been placed under a chair or behind the cabinet toe kick. I could see the exact spot in the kitchen where I had been scrubbing the sink. I could see the dish rack with the 3 plates. I could see the weak lamp glow on the counter. I could see my shoulders hunched like a person trying to make himself small. The fact that the photo existed meant someone had been in the kitchen with me. or a hidden camera had been watching, or both. Either way, it meant I had never been alone in that house, not even in daylight. The room felt like it tilted. I forced myself to back away from the board, to widen my view again, to remember that I was still alive and still standing and still holding a bat. That was when I heard the sound above me. Not the upstairs pacing I had heard before. This was different. A heavy step on the first floor. A creak that came from above the basement ceiling, closer than the upstairs hallway. The kind of creak that happens when a person crosses the hallway near the basement door. The sound was slow, weighted, confident. My entire body locked. Then another step. Creak, and another. Creak. The rhythm was unhurried, not sneaking, not trying to hide the sound. It was the sound of someone who knew the house would announce their movement for them. I thought of Mrs. Holloway. Small, careful, precise. Her steps had been light and controlled. These steps were heavier, broader, a different kind of presence. I stared at the baby monitor on the chair, and a cold understanding clicked into place with a clarity so sharp it almost felt calm. The camera was not here to record intruders. If it were about intruders, the camera would be pointed at the basement door from the basement side, or aimed toward the windows, or hidden in a corner. This camera was aimed at the stairs, at the exact spot where someone's face would appear when they came down. It was not security. It was a tally. It was confirmation. It recorded the moment a person chose to cross the boundary. A person like me. The heavy footsteps above stopped. Silence poured down through the basement ceiling like water. I held my breath and listened for the basement door to close, for the latch to click, for any sound that would tell me I was trapped. Instead, I heard a faint shift, like someone leaning closer to the basement door from the other side, like someone listening for me the way I had listened for them. The overhead bulb flickered once. The weak light stuttered, and for a second the basement was full of moving shadows. The chair looked like it was lunging. The corkboard looked like it was crawling. Then the light stabilized again. My heart hammered so hard, it felt like it would shake my ribs loose. I made a decision without thinking. I killed the basement light. I reached up to the switch and flipped it down. The bulb went out, and the basement fell into darkness instantly. My phone flashlight beam became the only light, a narrow cone that made everything outside it feel infinite. I turned off the phone light too. Complete darkness. For a second, I was blind and weightless, the kind of darkness that makes you question whether your eyes are even open. Then I moved. I backed away from the chair, away from the board, toward the shelves along the wall where shadows were thickest. My socked feet slid on the concrete. I tried to keep my breathing silent. I crouched behind a stack of clear storage bins and pressed my back against the cold wall. Bat held tight across my knees like it could keep the darkness out. Above me, the house creaked once. A single, heavy step, then another. Creak. The basement door hinge groaned faintly, as if pressure had been put on it from above, like someone resting a hand on the door without opening it yet. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, though it made no difference. In the darkness, I could hear my own blood. I could hear the tiny, settling pops of old wood. I could hear the faintest whisper of air moving through the vent above the stairs. Then, from somewhere above, a voice spoke. Not loud, not angry, calm, flat, rehearsed, as if it had been said many times before. "Do not make this difficult," the voice said. And in that moment, hidden in the dark beside a chair that had been waiting, and a board that had already taken my picture. I understood the worst part. They were not surprised I came down. They had been expecting it. They had been counting on it. 5, 1. 2 sets of footsteps, 1,050 words. In the dark, sound becomes a kind of vision. It is the only way you can understand the shape of a room without moving, the only way you can measure distance without seeing it. Every tiny noise becomes information. Every pause becomes its own message. I stayed crouched behind the storage bins with my back pressed to the concrete wall, bat locked across my knees, trying to keep my breathing shallow enough that it did not turn into panic. The basement smelled stronger without the overhead light, like the darkness released it. Damp earth, old wood, that faint metallic edge that made my tongue taste like pennies. Above me, the house creaked again. Then it creaked differently. Footsteps, not upstairs, not distant. Directly over the basement door. Directly over the stairs. Close enough that I could imagine the exact boards shifting under a person's weight. One step was light, careful, small, a soft pressure sound that was more of a polite complaint from the floor than a real creak. The other was heavy, confident. A longer groan from the wood, like the house had to work harder to hold it. 2 sets, 2 presences. They moved in a pattern that made my skin tighten. The lighter steps came first, hesitant, like someone approaching a line they did not want to cross. The heavier steps followed a beat behind, not hesitating at all. The heavier steps did not test the boards. They owned them. I heard the basement door hinge groan faintly as the door opened from above. The sound slid into the basement like cold air. Then the latch clicked. Clean, deliberate. The basement door did not slam. It did not swing wildly. It opened with controlled weight, the same way I had opened it earlier, only this time it was not me forcing myself. This time it was someone returning to a place they knew. For a moment, nothing else happened. No one came down. They simply stood there at the top of the stairs, letting the darkness settle. And then a phone flashlight turned on. A harsh white beam cut down the stairwell in a slow sweep, moving as if whoever held it understood exactly how shadows work. The light did not wander. It did not jitter. It painted the stairs methodically, step by step, railing to wall, searching for movement. The beam swept across the basement floor and climbed the shelving unit where I was hiding. I pressed my face into the crook of my arm, willing my body to become part of the wall. The light passed over the bins. It lingered for half a second on the clear plastic, revealing my reflection faintly, 2 dark eyes, wide and terrified. Then it moved on. The beam dipped toward the chair in the center of the basement. It paused there, almost reverently, like it was checking that the room was still arranged correctly. Like the chair and the monitor were tools that needed to be accounted for. I heard the heavy footsteps shift at the top of the stairs. A slow inhale. Then a voice spoke softly from above. "Come on," the voice said, patient and calm. It was a man's voice. Not old, not shaky. Smooth in a way that made it worse because it did not carry fear or uncertainty. It carried routine. A second voice answered, smaller, Mrs. Holloway. "I told you," she said, and her voice sounded different now. Thin, almost pleading. Not the flat, rehearsed tone she used with me. This was a voice you use when you are trying not to anger someone you cannot control. "I told you he would not," she said, and then stopped as if she had almost said something more revealing. The man's voice did not rise. "It is fine," he said. "They always do." The phrase hit me like ice because I had heard her earlier. They do that. She had said it about the upstairs pacing, like it was a known behavior, like it was expected. Now his voice confirmed it. They always do. Meaning, people always get curious. People always break the rule. People always come down. The flashlight beam swept again, slower this time. It moved across the shelves, across the wall, across the concrete floor. The beam cut over the corkboard, and the Polaroids gleamed briefly, catching the light like tiny, wet eyes. The man made a quiet sound, almost a hum, like he was pleased the board was still there. Mrs. Holloway's lighter steps shifted. "I do not like this," she said. The man answered without cruelty, but with authority. "You do not have to like it," he said. "You only have to do what you do." Her voice softened further, almost obedient. "I do," she said. That was when I understood the dynamic without needing to see them. Mrs. Holloway was not the one in control. She was not the predator I had built up in my mind during the week. She was not the mastermind with the plan and the system. She was part of the system. A host, a gatekeeper, a person who created the conditions. Dark rooms, sealed curtains, rules spoken gently but firmly, so someone else could do what they wanted. The phone beam swept down the stairs again, and this time it did not stop at the bottom. It moved deeper into the basement, angling toward the spot where I had killed the light, toward the shelves, toward the thick shadows. The beam started to search like it expected something to be there, like it knew. The heavy footsteps began to descend, creak. The first stair groaned under the weight, loud enough to vibrate through the basement walls. Creak. Another step. The flashlight beam dipped lower, held steady by someone above. The man was coming down, and Mrs. Holloway stayed at the top, her lighter footsteps not moving, her presence hovering like a warning sign that no longer served its purpose. I gripped the bat tighter until the aluminum pressed into my palms. My arms ached from holding still. My legs were cramped from crouching. I wanted to run. I wanted to stand. I wanted to be anywhere but behind those bins. But the beam was moving closer. It reached the shelves. It slid along the edge of the bins, too slow, too careful. It illuminated the outline of dust on the concrete where something had been dragged earlier. It caught the scuffed flour-like residue I had seen upstairs, now down here like a second language. Then the light stopped. Right on the space where I was hiding. Not directly on me, just close enough that my shadow should have been visible if the angle was right. The man paused mid-step on the stairs. Silence. In that still moment, I could hear Mrs. Holloway breathe at the top landing. Quick, shallow, nervous. A small animal sound. The man spoke softly, almost conversational. "I know you are here," he said. Not to her, but to the basement, to the darkness, to me. He took another step down. The stair creaked under him like a complaint. The flashlight beam shifted slightly, adjusting, becoming more precise. And I realized the most terrifying part was not that they were searching. It was that they were searching the way someone searches when they have done it many times before. Slow, patient, confident that the hiding place would eventually become irrelevant. Because the basement was not meant for hiding. It was meant for being found. 5.2, the search pattern, 1,050 words. The worst part about being hunted is not the fear. It is the intelligence. If the light had swung wildly, if the footsteps had stumbled, if the beam had darted from corner to corner like a nervous person who did not know what they were doing, I could have told myself there was a chance. I could have told myself this was improvisation, panic, chaos. But the beam did not roam. It worked. It moved in a pattern so clean I could feel my stomach tighten with a sick kind of respect. Left wall first. Floor line. Under the shelves. Behind the bins. Then the center. Then the far corner. Then the stairs again. Like a checklist being completed in silence. The phone flashlight was not just light. It was a tool. It swept across the basement with slow precision, and everywhere it paused made sense. The beam lingered on the places a person would choose instinctively, the shadowed gaps behind storage bins, the hollow beneath the bottom stair, the space behind the chair in the center where someone might crouch and hope the darkness would swallow them. It was as if the man held a mental map of every hiding spot before he even stepped onto the concrete. I stayed compressed behind the bins, my knees jammed against my chest, my back pressed into the wall so hard it felt like I was trying to melt into it. I did not blink. I did not swallow. Every time my throat tightened with the urge to breathe, I forced the air out through my nose in tiny, controlled releases. My chest started to burn. The bat lay across my knees like a joke. In my mind, I had pictured it as protection, the way people picture a baseball bat in the dark as some kind of equalizer. Down here, with a man moving like he owned the space and a woman upstairs who sounded like she was following orders, the bat felt like a prop I had brought into someone else's scene. The heavy footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The beam lifted slightly, illuminating the chair and the baby monitor. The man's silhouette moved into the center of the basement, and even without seeing his face clearly, I could sense his posture. Upright, calm, patient. A person who did not need to rush because time belonged to him. He turned slowly, the beam following his movement. It checked the corkboard first, as if that mattered more than me. It glided over the Polaroids, making them shine briefly like wet skin. It passed over the sticky notes, delivery, girl with braids, tall one, then paused at the bottom row where my photo was pinned. For a moment, the light stayed there, as if he was acknowledging that I had earned my place on the board. Then the beam dropped and began moving again, systematic. It went to the shelving unit by the far wall. Pause. Sweep low. Sweep high. It traveled along the floor line, checking the base of the wall like a person might be pressed flat there. It moved under a tarp, behind a stack of folded cloth. It slid behind the clear bins where I was hiding, just missing my shadow by inches. I could hear him breathe. Not heavy, not strained, normal. That was almost worse than the voice. It meant he was not excited, not angry, not afraid. He was doing a job. Upstairs, Mrs. Holloway shifted once on the landing. The floor creaked lightly under her weight. "Just take him upstairs," she whispered. Her voice sounded small now, almost fragile. Not the controlled flat tone she used with me. Not the careful hostess voice. This was a voice pleading for the smallest possible harm. The man did not answer her immediately. The beam continued its path, completing another section of the basement. It paused at the base of the stairs, then moved to the shadow under the staircase where a person might tuck themselves and hope to become a forgotten shape. Nothing. The beam returned to the shelves. Closer this time. My lungs screamed. I forced myself to hold still as the light crept along the plastic edges. The bins glowed faintly, their clear sides revealing nothing but vague shapes and shadows. The beam reached the corner near my feet. I felt my heartbeat slam so hard it made me dizzy. Then the light hit my shoe. For half a second, the beam landed directly on the toe of my socked foot. White fabric, dirty from the basement concrete, undeniable. I could not move. I could not breathe. The light held there, steady, as if the man was looking straight at it. And then, slowly, the beam slid away. Not because he missed it. Not because it was accidental. It moved away with the same controlled pace it had used everywhere else, as if he had seen my shoe and chosen not to react yet. A teasing gesture, a demonstration of control. The message was clear and wordless. I know where you are. I am deciding what happens next. My chest seized. A small, involuntary gasp clawed at my throat, and I had to clamp my lips shut with my teeth to keep it from escaping. The man's heavy footsteps shifted, and the beam angled upward slightly, illuminating the wall above my hiding spot like he was studying the geometry of the space. He still did not move to grab me. He let the moment hang, like he wanted me to break, like the true goal was not to catch me. It was to make me choose to reveal myself, to make me run. Upstairs, Mrs. Holloway whispered again, sharper now, nervous. "Please," she said. The man finally spoke, still calm. "Not yet," he said. Those two words sent a cold wave through me because they implied there was a later, a schedule, a routine, a sequence he followed. The beam swept away again, continuing the search pattern as if my exposed shoe had been a checkpoint, not a discovery. It moved toward the other side of the basement, checking behind the chair, under the shelves, across the concrete where dust lay like a thin skin. Each pause was measured. Each movement was quiet. I tasted metal in my mouth. My legs cramped so badly my thigh twitched once, a small, involuntary spasm. I froze harder, terrified the twitch would make the bins scrape, terrified any noise would turn his patience into action. The beam returned to the stairs, climbed them halfway, then swept down again in a slower arc, like the man was resetting his angle. That is when I understood something that made my stomach drop even lower. This was not his first pass. He was adjusting, learning, testing how I reacted when the light got close. And somewhere deep in my body, under all the fear, a darker truth settled in. He was not searching because he did not know where I was. He was searching because he wanted the search itself to be part of it, to stretch it, to control it, to make sure that when he finally came for me, I would already be exhausted from holding my breath, already trembling, already convinced I had no choice but to do exactly what he wanted. And the bat on my knees stayed useless and cold, like a symbol of how little my intentions mattered in a room designed for someone else's routine. 5-3, the porch, 1,050 words. The moment I decided to run, my body felt strangely calm. Fear does that sometimes. It burns so hot for so long that it turns into something clean and mechanical. A switch flips. The panic becomes focus. Everything in you narrows down to timing, distance, sound. I waited until the phone beam drifted away from my hiding spot again. The man was still moving through his pattern, patient, methodical. The light slid across the corkboard, across the chair, across the floor. It paused at the bottom of the stairs as if he was thinking. Above, Mrs. Holloway's lighter steps shifted once. A soft creak like she had moved her weight from one foot to the other. The beam lifted, angled upward, and swept along the stairwell wall. That was my window. I pushed off the concrete with my hands and rose fast, the bat slipping from my knees. It clinked softly against the bin, one tiny sound that felt like a gunshot in my head. I did not pick it up. I did not have time for dignity. I lunged toward the stairs in a low sprint, staying close to the wall, feet sliding on the cold concrete. The basement air felt thicker as I moved through it, as if the room resisted sudden motion. The first stair creaked under my foot. Loud, angry, reporting me. I took the next one anyway, then the next, climbing two at a time with the kind of desperation that makes you forget pain. The wood groaned under me like it was trying to hold me back. My socks slipped on the worn edges of the steps. Behind me, the man's voice cut through the darkness. "Hey," he said, not shouted, not surprised, just present, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. The phone beam snapped toward the stairs, faster now, not panicked, correcting. I kept climbing. The beam hit my calf for a second, the harsh light catching the fabric of my jeans, and my stomach dropped because now I was not an idea, I was a target. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed my shoulder into the basement door, pushing it wider. The hallway lamp flooded my eyes with weak yellow light that felt almost holy compared to the basement. Mrs. Holloway stood at the end of the hall, not in front of me, not blocking the path, off to the side, near the kitchen doorway, her hands folded as always, posture perfect. Her face was pale in the lamp glow, her eyes wide but empty. She did not move to stop me. She did not move to help me. She simply watched. I sprinted past her, through the kitchen where candle wax smelled faint and sweet, past the silent refrigerator and the dark corner where a television should have been. My feet slapped the wood, and every board screamed under me. The house that had been so controlled and muted suddenly became loud with my escape. The front door was right there, but my hand fumbled on the knob because my fingers were shaking too hard. I yanked it open. Cold night air punched me in the face, sharp and wet, full of wind and distant field smell. The porch light buzzed above me like it was laughing. I stumbled down the steps, and the boards creaked beneath my feet in a frantic cascade. The gravel driveway crunched loudly as I ran. The sound was huge in the open air, like a signal you could hear for miles. My lungs burned with cold. My car sat at the edge of the gravel like the only thing in the world that mattered. I hit the driver's door and yanked it open. The hinge squealed. The sound was high and awful, the kind that makes your stomach drop because it announces you. I threw myself into the seat and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows. My keys were in my pocket, but suddenly my pocket felt like a trap. I fumbled, fingers numb, pulling them out one by one, keychain, a loose coin, a receipt, before the keys finally came free. I jammed them into the ignition. The engine did not start. It turned over once, slow and reluctant. My heart slammed. I twisted the key again. The starter struggled, whining like it was tired. For a split second, I had the sick thought that the car smelled like her house because the house had already gotten into it, already claimed it. Then the engine caught. It roared to life in the quiet, and relief hit me so hard, I almost cried. I threw the car into reverse and backed out too fast. Gravel spraying. The tires slipped for a second, then grabbed. My hands were sweating on the wheel. As I turned the car toward the driveway exit, my eyes flicked up to the porch. Mrs. Holloway stood there, not chasing, not calling the police, not shouting for help, just standing in the porch, light like a statue, her hands folded, her face blank as if emotion had been removed from it. For a half second, I thought maybe she was relieved. Then I noticed the window beside her, the porch window. It was dark behind the glass, but the porch light made it reflective. For a moment, my own headlights caught it at the right angle. And in that reflection, I saw something that should not have been there. A figure standing just inside the house, perfectly still. Not Mrs. Holloway, taller, broader, positioned in the hallway where the kitchen shadows would hide him. His head slightly tilted, as if he was watching me the way you watch something you already own. The figure did not move, not a step, not a wave, not even the small sway of someone shifting weight. He stood like part of the house. I felt a cold wave wash through my stomach. I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine whining as the car lunged forward. As I pulled onto the county road, gravel popping beneath the tires, I heard Mrs. Holloway's voice carry out into the night. It was gentle, almost kind, like a reminder you give someone who left their wallet on the counter. "You forgot something that belongs here," she called. I did not look back, but my hands clenched the wheel harder, because in the rearview mirror the porch light was shrinking, and I could still see her standing there in the glow, not waving, not moving, just watching. And the worst part was the way her words landed in my head, calm and certain, like she was not guessing, like she knew exactly what I had forgotten, like she knew I would realize it soon enough. 6.1. The decision not to call, 1,050 words. I do not remember the first few miles. I remember my hands locked on the steering wheel hard enough that my wrists hurt. I remember the county road stretching ahead like a dark ribbon, and the fields on either side dissolving into a moving wall of black. I remember the porch light shrinking behind me until it became just another faint point in the distance. I remember breathing like I had been underwater. Everything else blurred into motion. When I finally hit the main road and saw the first cluster of normal lights, gas station neon, a lit sign for a 24-hour diner, a couple of headlights coming toward me, I felt my body unclench just enough to realize how tight it had been. My shoulders ached. My jaw felt sore from clamping my teeth. My hands were shaking so hard, the steering wheel vibrated. The radio came on automatically when I started the car earlier, and I realized I had left it on. Music flooded the cabin, bright, aggressive, too cheerful. A voice from the speakers tried to be funny. It made my skin crawl. I snapped the volume down, then off completely. Silence filled the car immediately. At first I thought that would help. No noise, no stimulation, just me and the road. But within seconds, the quiet became a problem. It was the wrong kind of quiet. It was the kind of quiet that lets you hear the memory of a doorknob turning, lets you hear a chair leg scraping across concrete, lets you hear the exact tone of a man's calm voice saying, "Do not make this difficult." I flicked the radio back on. The music hit me like a slap. I turned it off again, on, off, on, off. It felt ridiculous, like a nervous tick, but I could not settle on either option. Noise made me feel exposed. Silence made me feel hunted. So I drove with the radio off, and the windows cracked slightly, letting cold air hiss into the cabin like white noise. The wind sounded like static through the gap, and it kept my brain from filling the space with imagined footsteps. My phone sat in the cup holder, screen dark. I did not pick it up for a long time. I did not want to see missed calls. I did not want to see the clock. I did not want anything in my hand that could turn into a decision. A normal person calls the police. That is what the part of me that still believed in normal kept repeating. I had been inside a house with surveillance photos of strangers. I had been threatened in the basement by someone with a strap in his hand. I had seen a figure behind Mrs. Holloway watching me leave. A normal person calls the police and says, "I think something is wrong at this address." But I did not call, and the reasons were ugly in a way I do not like admitting. First, I knew what I would sound like. I would sound like a kid telling a story. A temp worker who took a cash job from a random flyer. A guy who ignored a rule. went into someone's basement in the middle of the night, and then ran out. I could already hear the questions. Why did you go down there? Were you stealing? Were you trespassing? Were you high? Were you looking for something? Did you threaten her? Did you break anything? In my head, I could see the officer's face, polite at first, then skeptical, then annoyed. The kind of skepticism that makes you start defending yourself until you sound even guiltier. Second, I feared the most practical thing: being forced to return. Because if the police took me seriously at all, they would want to go back to the house. They would want me to show them where the basement door was, where the corkboard was, where the chair was. They would want me to stand on that porch again under that buzzing light. They would want me to walk into that muted hallway again with the curtains closed. They would want me to point at the basement door like it was a simple object, like it did not feel like it looked back. And I could not do it. Not that night. Not with my nerves still screaming. Third, and maybe worst, I did not trust what they would find. The basement had been too clean, too maintained, too intentional. It felt like a place that could be reset quickly, like a set that could be dismantled between takes. The Polaroids could be taken down in minutes. The baby monitor could be removed. The chair could be folded up and stored. The sticky notes could be peeled away. Everything could vanish. And then what? Then I would be the person who dragged police out to an old woman's house to accuse her based on a feeling and a story. Then my name would be somewhere in a system I did not understand. I thought about that word I had seen on the corkboard: returned. My mouth tasted metallic again, so I drove home shaking, and I did not call. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, the lights in the parking lot looked too bright, too harsh. The familiar shapes of my neighbors' cars felt like props in a stage set. I sat in my car with the engine off and listened. Normal sounds came through the windshield: distant traffic, a dog barking, someone's TV behind a window. It should have been comforting. Instead, it made me feel like the world was pretending. Like all of it could shut off for 1 second the way it did in Mrs. Holloway's house, and something else could move in that gap. I carried my overnight bag upstairs and locked my door behind me. I checked it twice. I looked through the peephole even though there was nothing there. Inside, my apartment smelled like laundry detergent and cheap candle wax. Normal, safe smells. I threw my jacket onto a chair and realized it still carried that faint, damp earth note. It had seeped into the fabric like smoke. I washed my hands. I brushed my teeth. I stood in my bathroom with the light on and stared at my own face until it looked unfamiliar. Then I tried to sleep. I lay on my bed with my phone face down and the room dark, and I waited for the normal quiet to settle. The HVAC in my apartment clicked on. Air rushed softly through the vent. Then it clicked off. The sudden silence that followed felt like a countdown. My brain started counting with it, without my permission. 1 cycle, pause, another cycle, pause. In the pauses, I heard the memory of footsteps in a hallway. In the pauses, I heard the memory of a doorknob turning slowly, testing. In the pauses, I heard the scrape of a chair leg on concrete, faint but deliberate, like a signal. I pulled the blanket up too high, the same childish reflex I had hated in her guest room. I stared at my own ceiling, and the longer I lay there, the clearer it became that calling the police was not the only decision I had made. I had made another one too, without admitting it out loud. I had decided to keep this to myself, not because I was brave, because some part of me believed, deep down, cold and ugly, that the moment I said her address out loud to someone official, I would be stepping back into her system, and I did not know if the system ever truly lets you leave. 6.2. The smell that followed. 1,040 words. The next morning, I expected relief. I expected the ordinary daylight in my apartment to erase the night like a bad dream. I expected my own walls, my own familiar clutter, my own cheap coffee maker gurgling on the counter to remind me that I had escaped an isolated place, a strange house on a country road, a bad decision that ended without consequence. But the first thing I noticed when I sat up in bed was the smell. Not in the room. On me. It rose off my skin and hair as soon as the warmth of sleep faded. Damp earth. Cold wood. That sealed, underground note that made my stomach tense before my brain could rationalize it. It did not feel like a normal, musty jacket smell. It felt like a place. Like I had carried the basement home in my pores. I went straight to the bathroom and showered too hot. I scrubbed my scalp. I scrubbed my neck where the blanket had scratched me. I used too much soap, like more soap could erase memory. When I stepped out and breathed in, I could still catch it faintly. I thought I was imagining it until I walked into my living room and saw my jacket hanging over the back of my chair. The smell was strongest there. It was not subtle anymore once I focused on it. It hovered around that fabric like a stain you cannot see but cannot ignore. I lifted the jacket with 2 fingers and brought it closer. The earth smell hit me hard enough to make my eyes water. I washed it that day. Hot water. Extra detergent. The kind with too much artificial fresh fragrance. I watched the washer spin and told myself this was simple. Cloth holds smells. Basements smell. I had been in a basement. Done. When the cycle finished, I pulled the jacket out and held it up to my face like a test. For a second, I thought it worked. The detergent smell was strong, bright, normal. Then underneath it, like a second layer, the damp earth note still lived there. Not as sharp as before, not loud, persistent, like something that had soaked in deeper than fabric. I washed it again the next day, and again the smell remained, faint but present, like it had learned how to hide behind the detergent. That was the first sign that I was not done with that house. The second sign was smaller, almost stupid. It started as a speck of dust. On the 3rd day after I ran, I put my jacket on to go to work. It was cold that morning. The sky was the same kind of gray it had been on Friday, and the wind outside my building had that static whisper to it. I shoved my hands into my jacket pockets and felt something gritty against my fingertips. I pulled my hand out and looked. A pale speck of dust sat on my skin, almost chalky. Not lint, not flour. It looked like fine drywall powder, or the kind of residue you get from old concrete when it has been disturbed. I brushed it off without thinking. A few hours later, on my break, I shoved my hand into the pocket again and felt the same grit. This time I pulled the pocket lining out and shook it over the trash can. A few tiny pale grains fell out, barely visible. I tapped the fabric and watched for more. Nothing. I told myself it was normal. Pockets collect debris. I had crawled around behind bins in a basement. Of course, some dust stuck to me. That night, I took the jacket off and turned it inside out over my bathtub. I shook it hard. I ran my fingers along the seams and corners. I vacuumed the pockets just to prove I could. I went to bed feeling slightly embarrassed at myself. The next day, I reached into the pocket and felt it again. A speck, a tiny chalky grain against my fingertip. I froze. I pulled the pocket lining out slowly, stared at it under the kitchen light, and saw nothing. The fabric looked clean, no obvious dirt, no smudges. But when I rubbed my thumb and forefinger together, I felt that fine grit and saw the faintest pale streak on my skin. It kept happening. I would clean the pocket. I would wash the jacket. I would shake it out. I would vacuum it. And a day later, somehow, that pale dust would be there again. Just 1 or 2 grains, like a reminder placed deliberately, like a mark left quietly where only I would find it. There's a special kind of fear that comes from something small that should be manageable. A big threat. You can fight or flee. A tiny recurring detail makes you start doubting the rules of your own world. It makes you start asking questions you cannot answer without sounding insane. Where is it coming from? How is it still there? Did I miss something? Or is it being added? That last thought came and went in my mind like a bad taste. I pushed it away because accepting it would mean accepting that something had followed me, and I needed to believe I was safe. So I built my comfort back up with logic. The house was far away. It was in the county, off a road with long stretches of nothing. It was not like someone could stumble into my apartment complex by accident. I never gave Mrs. Holloway my address. I never filled out paperwork. I never signed anything. It was cash, no names, no forms, no trail. The closest thing she had to me was my phone number, and I could change that. I could block her number. I could disappear into the normal noise of town. I repeated those facts to myself like a prayer. Far away, no address, no trail. I told myself the dust was in the seam, trapped somewhere. I told myself the smell had soaked deep into the fabric and my detergent was not strong enough. I told myself the jacket was just ruined and that I should throw it away if it bothered me that much. That is what a sane person would do. But I did not throw it away, because the jacket felt like evidence now. And some part of me, quiet, ugly, stubborn, did not want to let go of the only proof I had that I had not imagined everything. I kept wearing it. I kept checking the pockets, and every time I found that pale dust again, tiny and stubborn, my thoughts would drift back to the corkboard labels and the tally marks and the word returned. I would look around my apartment like it might suddenly feel muted the way her house did. And even though I kept telling myself I was safe, I could not stop thinking about the way Mrs. Holloway called after me on the porch. Gentle as a reminder. You forgot something that belongs here. At the time, I had assumed she meant my overnight bag, or money, or some stupid personal item. Now, with the smell in my jacket and the dust in my pocket, another possibility began to form in my mind. Cold and slow, maybe I did not forget something there. Maybe something from there came with me. 6.3, the SD card, 1 through 70 words. I found it on a Tuesday night, the kind of night that should have been forgettable. I had worked a late shift, the store quiet in that dead stretch between dinner and midnight, when the fluorescent lights feel too white and the aisles feel too long. I came home with the smell of burnt coffee still stuck in my clothes, tossed my keys in the same bowl by the door, and stood for a moment in my kitchen listening to my own refrigerator hum like it was the only proof I was still in a normal place. The jacket was on the back of my chair again. I had washed it twice, but I kept wearing it because winter did not care what I was going through. It still carried that faint, damp earth note underneath detergent and cold air. I kept telling myself it was in my head, that I had trained my brain to expect the smell, so it found it. That night, though, the smell was not what bothered me. The dust was back. I felt it the second my fingers slid into the inner pocket. Tiny pale grit like chalk, like the residue you get on your hands after touching old concrete. I pulled my hand out and held it under the kitchen light. 2 specks clung to my skin. I stared at them longer than I should have. Then I did something I had been avoiding because it felt obsessive. I decided to cut the problem open. I grabbed a seam ripper from a junk drawer, the kind you keep from an old sewing kit you never use. I sat at my small kitchen table with the overhead light on, jacket inside out, and I started working at the inner lining of the pocket. It felt ridiculous, like I was performing surgery on a piece of clothing because I could not perform surgery on my own fear. The thread gave slowly. The lining separated with a soft, tearing sound. I kept expecting to find lint, a penny, a piece of gravel wedged into the corner. Instead, my fingers touched something hard, small, flat, plastic. My stomach tightened before I even pulled it out. I pinched it between my fingertips and slid it into the light. A tiny SD card, the kind you use in cameras. For a second, my brain refused to label it. It tried to treat it like a random piece of plastic, like a broken tab from something. But it was unmistakable. A micro SD, black and clean, with faint white lettering I could not fully read without squinting. My mouth went dry. I held it in my palm and felt the absurd weight of it, not physical weight, but meaning. I had not put it there. I knew I had not. I did not own anything that used one. I did not have a camera. I did not take Polaroids. I did not go around storing tiny memory cards in jacket linings like a person in a spy movie. I sat there at my table listening to my apartment. Fridge hum, distant neighbor TV, the soft tick of my wall clock, and I tried to decide which part of the situation scared me most. That it was there, or that it had been placed where only I would find it. I should have thrown it away. I should have put it in a bag and taken it to the police station and said nothing except, "I found this, and I am scared." But the same ugly reasons rose in me again. Fear of being blamed, fear of not being believed, fear of being dragged back into the orbit of that house. And beneath all of that, something else moved, the need to know. Curiosity is not a cute trait in moments like this. It is a flaw. It is a hook. I had already gone down into the basement because I could not stand being blind. Now the SD card sat in my hand like a continuation of that same weakness. I went to my laptop. It was an old one, the kind with a fan that kicks on too loud when you open too many tabs. I set it on the table, plugged it in, and stared at the SD card like it might burn me. I did not have an SD slot, so I dug through a drawer until I found an old USB card reader from years ago. I had no memory of why I owned it. That alone made my skin prickle. The apartment felt too quiet as I clicked everything into place. Card into reader. Reader into USB port. The laptop made its normal, soft chime, except I had turned system sounds off months ago. I hated those little noises. I had disabled them in settings and forgotten about it. Still, there it was. A small, crisp notification sound that did not belong. I froze with my fingers hovering above the keyboard. Then my screen lit up with a new window. A drive name I did not recognize. A list of folders with plain labels. No personal names. No messy organization. Just a structure that looked like it belonged to someone who thought in categories. My pulse started counting itself in my throat. Inside the main folder were files with dates. At first, that felt normal. Cameras timestamp footage. People label things by day, but the dates made my stomach drop. There were files from the week I worked at Mrs. Holloway's house, and there were files dated after the Friday night I ran, 2 days after, 4 days after. A file stamped with yesterday's date. I stared at the list until my eyes started to sting. My first thought was the simplest one. The camera's date was wrong. The settings were off. People forget to set times. Then I saw the file times. Multiple entries each day, spread out in a pattern that looked too intentional for a broken clock. Morning, afternoon, night, like check-ins. I clicked one at random. My hand shook so badly, I had to grip the mouse with both fingers like I was controlling a wild thing. The video loaded, a 3-second clip. My kitchen, from low angle, not from counter height, not from eye level. From near the floor, angled up, like the camera had been placed beneath the cabinet toe kick or set on a low stool. The shot captured my legs and torso as I stood at the sink, scrubbing something. The dish rack was visible. The light looked the same weak yellow it always did at night. My face was not in frame, but my posture was unmistakable. The clip ended. I stared at the black screen after it stopped, waiting for my brain to find a safe explanation. There wasn't one. I clicked another file. Another 3 seconds. My apartment hallway, outside my door. Same low angle, like the camera was sitting on the floor near the baseboard, pointed upward. My feet walked past. I could hear keys jingle faintly, my own keys, the sound recorded from too close. The clip ended. My hands went numb. I scrolled down the list, forcing myself to keep looking because stopping felt worse. Then I saw a file name that made my skin turn cold in a different way. It was dated today, time-stamped less than an hour earlier. I had been home less than an hour. I clicked it. The file opened. 3 seconds. My apartment stairwell. Filmed from low angle, like from the bottom step looking up. The camera captured the worn edges of the stairs, the metal handrail, the pale wall with scuff marks where people's shoes hit it. The angle was wrong for any building security camera. It was intimate, ground level, the perspective of something waiting. In the clip, I appeared at the top landing. Not my face, my legs, my shoes, the way I hesitated before stepping down because my hands were full. I watched myself move in that tiny frame, watched myself exist from a viewpoint that should not have been possible. The clip ended. I sat completely still, laptop fan whirring, fridge humming, the distant muffled laugh track from someone's TV bleeding through my wall. My mouth tasted like metal again. I had the sudden nauseating thought that the SD card was not evidence of what happened at Mrs. Holloway's house. It was proof the house had extended past its property line. I moved the cursor to close the window, and my laptop made that sound again. A small system noise I had disabled. Crisp, cheerful, wrong. The cursor shifted slightly on its own, drifting down the file list by a fraction of an inch, like a hand had nudged it, like something was selecting the next file for me. I stared at the screen, not breathing, and in the reflection of the dark parts of the display, I could see my own eyes wide and shining, like a person watching a horror video of someone else. Except it was my apartment, my stairwell, my life, and the next file was already highlighted. 7.1. Proof that breaks the brain. 1,060 words. I replayed it until the 3 seconds stopped feeling like time and started feeling like a message. Click, the file opens. My apartment stairwell, filmed from the bottom step, looking up. The image is slightly grainy, like it was taken in low light, but it does not matter. There is nothing ambiguous about it. The chipped paint on the handrail. The scuff marks on the wall where someone dragged a piece of furniture once. The uneven edge on the third step where the cheap carpet is lifting. My building, my place, my air. I watched my legs appear at the top landing again. my shoes stepping into frame, and my stomach clenched the same way it had clenched when I saw my own back on the corkboard in Mrs. Holloway's basement. That same cold recognition, that same sensation of being turned into an object. The clip ended. The screen went black for a beat. The laptop fan whined. The fridge hummed behind me like a heartbeat trying to convince me the world was still normal. I clicked play again and again. The more I watched, the more my brain tried to find a seam, a flaw, a way to doubt it. That is what the mind does when a fact threatens to break its structure. It looks for a loophole. Maybe it is another stairwell. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe it is a coincidence. But the details stacked up and made coincidence impossible. The small dark stain on the landing that I had tried to scrub out last month and failed. The exact pattern of the overhead light reflection on the paint. The faint glimpse of the red fire extinguisher sign at the edge of the frame, half cut off. Even the sound, my own keys, my own breathing, the faint squeak my left shoe makes when the sole is wet. It was my life recorded from a position that should not exist. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. Then I slammed the laptop shut like that could end it. The sudden silence after the hinge clicked shut was worse. I sat there at my kitchen table in the dim light, hands flat on the wood, breathing shallow, listening for anything that did not belong. Every normal sound became suspicious. The refrigerator compressor cycling, the faint tick of the wall clock, the distant hum of traffic outside, the soft rushing sound of my HVAC vent as it kicked on. Each sound landed like a reminder that the world keeps making noise even when something is wrong. My body moved before my brain made a plan. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor, and the scrape made my skin jump because it sounded too much like the chair leg in the basement. I stepped away from it like it had betrayed me. I checked my front door. Locked, deadbolt thrown, chain in place. I checked it again anyway, twisting the knob, pulling the chain, pressing my shoulder against the door as if I could feel whether the lock was truly holding. My hands shook against the cold metal. I crossed to my windows. The blinds were closed, but I pushed them aside and looked out. Parking lot lights, empty spots, a couple of cars, a person walking a dog in the distance, head down against the wind. Nothing wrong, nothing obvious. That did not help, because I understood now that obvious was not the style. The horror I had stumbled into did not announce itself with broken glass or forced doors. It announced itself with angles, with quiet recordings, with proof that appears after you swear you are safe. I checked the window locks anyway. Each latch clicked into place with a sound that felt too small to be meaningful. Then I walked through my apartment room by room, turning on lights, the way people do in movies. Kitchen light, living room light, bedroom light, bathroom light, bright, bright, bright. I opened closets. I checked behind the curtains. I looked under the bed even though there was barely space. I stood in my bathroom and stared at my shower curtain like it had personally insulted me. Then, humiliatingly, I pulled it back. There was nothing there. The tub was empty. The drain was clean. The shampoo bottles stood in their usual lineup, like innocent witnesses. I hated myself for doing it. Not because it was irrational, because it was rational in the ugliest way. Because a part of me had already accepted that someone could be in my home without me knowing. The SD card had taught my brain that the rules were different now. I walked back into the hallway and listened. No footsteps in my unit, but sound carries in old apartment buildings. A neighbor's TV muffled through walls. Someone's cabinet door closing 2 units away. A faint footfall in the stairwell outside. Every external sound became something my body wanted to label. That is a neighbor. That is plumbing. That is nothing. I returned to my kitchen and opened the laptop again because the need to confirm was stronger than the need to rest. The file list was still there. The SD card was still in the reader. I hovered my hand over it, thinking about pulling it out and snapping it in half. But my eyes returned to the stairwell clip because that was the one that mattered. That was the one that turned everything inside out. I clicked it again. My stairwell. Bottom step. Looking up. The worst part was not that it existed. The worst part was the angle. It was not a casual recording. It was not someone holding a phone at chest height, trying to get a quick shot. It was low. Patient. As if the camera had been placed there and left. As if whoever filmed it was not standing behind the lens. As if whoever filmed it did not need to move. The angle made my skin crawl because it implied waiting. It implied time. It implied that the person behind the camera did not rush to catch me in frame. They simply positioned the lens where it would eventually see me, like setting a trap. The 3 seconds ended, and the frame went dark. In the reflection of the screen, I saw my own face, pale and tight, eyes fixed, mouth slightly open like I had forgotten how to breathe. I realized, sitting there, that I had been thinking about Mrs. Holloway's house as if it were a place you could drive away from, a property line you could cross and leave behind. But the SD card did not care about distance. The recording angle did not care about county roads or gravel driveways. The angle had moved. It had relocated into my life the same way the smell had relocated into my jacket, quietly, persistently, without asking permission. And as I watched the low, patient frame of my stairwell again, I understood something that felt like my brain cracking around a single ugly truth. Whatever this was, it did not need me to go back to the basement. It had already learned how to bring the basement to me. 7.2. The 1-second mechanical hush, 1,070 words. That night, I tried to build normal back from scratch. I made food I did not taste. I left lights on longer than I needed to. I put on a show and let it play in the background without watching, just to keep a human voice in the air. I told myself I was overreacting, that I had watched too many horror videos, that my brain was taking a single weird event and turning it into a whole mythology. Then I turned everything off and tried to sleep anyway, because exhaustion always wins eventually. In bed, the world returned to its usual soundtrack. The refrigerator hum in my kitchen, steady and deep. The soft breath of my HVAC vent, cycling on and off like a tired animal. Distant traffic outside, muted by the building's walls. Occasional tire hiss on wet pavement, a far-off engine. The soft Doppler shift of a car passing through an intersection 2 blocks away. Even my neighbor contributed their normal noise. A faint thump now and then, a muffled laugh track, a cabinet door shutting. It was the kind of soundscape you stop noticing when life is ordinary. It is comforting precisely because it is unremarkable. It makes you feel held inside a predictable world. I stared at the ceiling and forced myself to count those sounds like they were proof. Fridge hum, HVAC breath, traffic, wall clock, my own breathing. I started to drift, not into real sleep, but into that thin, shallow place where your mind loosens its grip on the room. And then it happened. The 1-second hush. It was not gradual. It did not fade in the way normal quiet does when a show ends or when traffic slows. It snapped. The refrigerator stopped mid-hum as if someone had pulled its plug. The HVAC cut off mid-breath. The distant traffic sound vanished so completely it felt impossible, like the city outside my building had been removed for a moment. Even the neighbor's background noise dropped out, not fading, but cutting off like a channel being muted. For 1 second, my apartment went dead. Not peaceful dead, mechanical dead. The kind of silence you hear in a recording when someone has cut the audio track. My eyes opened instantly. My body did not sit up. It did not move. It simply became alert in the most primal way, like an animal freezing in tall grass. In that 1 second hush, I heard it. A soft scrape. Not loud, not dramatic. A controlled drag across a hard surface. Chair leg on concrete. The same sound I had heard under Mrs. Holloway's house, now thinner, closer, as if it was on the other side of a wall instead of under a floor. It came from inside my building, not from the kitchen, not from my bedroom. From the direction of my front door, beyond it, somewhere in the hallway or stairwell, close enough that my skin tightened as if the sound had touched it. The scrape stopped. The silence held for a fraction of a second longer than my brain could accept. Then the world snapped back on. The refrigerator compressor kicked in with a heavy clunk. The HVAC resumed with a dry exhale. Traffic sound returned like someone had unmuted the city. A neighbor's TV laugh track popped back in mid-sentence. Everything continued as if nothing had happened. Except my heart was beating so hard, it made the mattress tremble. I lay perfectly still, listening, waiting for another scrape, another hush, another proof that I had not imagined it. Nothing came. Just the normal sounds again, rolling forward. I told myself there was a rational explanation, power fluctuation, a breaker hiccup, some weird overlap of cycles where the fridge and HVAC happened to stop at the same time, and the traffic outside had a lull, and my brain, primed by the SD card, filled the gap with a remembered scrape. That is what I told myself, but my body did not believe it, because it was not only the silence, it was the timing. That exact 1 second of unnatural hush felt too familiar, too precise, too much like the moment in Mrs. Holloway's house when the world shut off to make sure I heard what moved below. Back then, I had thought the silence belonged to the house. Now, lying in my own bed, I realized the silence might belong to something else. Something that could happen anywhere there are machines, anywhere there is a hum to cut and resume. Something that uses the ordinary soundscape as cover, then removes it for a heartbeat to create a private moment. A moment where it can communicate. A moment where it can move. I sat up slowly, my blanket sliding down my chest, and listened toward my door. The apartment hallway outside was quiet. I could not hear footsteps. I could not hear voices. I could not hear the elevator. But the building itself has its own sounds. Pipes settling, distant doors closing. And now, because of that hush, every one of those sounds felt like it might be the wrong one. I got out of bed and walked to the peephole, my feet cold on the floor. I did not turn on any lights. I did not want to announce myself. I leaned in and looked out. The hallway was empty, dim light from the ceiling fixtures, beige carpet, a dark stairwell door at the end. Nothing moving, nothing obvious. And that was the problem. Because the SD card had already proven that someone could be there without my awareness. That a camera could be placed low and patient. That empty only means empty at the height you choose to look. I backed away from the door and returned to bed. Not because I felt safe, but because I did not know what action would help. I lay there with my eyes open and waited for the next hush. It did not come right away. Minutes passed, then more. The fridge hummed, the HVAC breathed, The city outside kept living, and just when my body started to loosen again, the silence happened a second time. Another 1-second mechanical blank. This time, the scrape was clearer. A tiny drag that sounded like it came from the stairwell itself, like something low to the ground was shifting position on a concrete step. Then everything came back, and I understood, lying there in the returned noise, that the true horror was not that someone had followed me. It was that something had learned how to recreate the basement's conditions anywhere. It did not need her house. It did not need her rules. All it needed was a building full of ordinary machines and ordinary sounds, and 1 second where it could make all of them stop. 7.3, the doorknob, again, 1,090 words. I started writing the email because I needed a witness. Not the police, not my friends, not my family. I could not stand the thought of explaining this to someone who would look at me with that careful concern people use when they think you are unraveling. A horror channel felt safer, a place where stories like mine were supposed to exist, a place where the unbelievable could be held up to the light without immediately being dismissed as a symptom. So I sat at my kitchen table at 1:23 a.m., laptop open, cursor blinking like a heartbeat. My apartment was quiet in the normal way at first. The refrigerator hummed, deep and steady, the kind of hum you never notice until you are desperate for something predictable. The HVAC breathed through the vent in the wall with a dry rush, then clicked off, then on again. Outside, distant traffic hissed and faded. Somewhere above me, a neighbor's TV murmured softly through the ceiling, a thin human sound that made the building feel occupied by ordinary lives. I wrote anyway. I wrote about the flyer, the cash job, the curtains, the rule. I wrote about the basement door and the way it felt like it looked back. I wrote about the chair in the center of the room and the baby monitor aimed at the stairs. I wrote about the Polaroids and the labels that were not names. I wrote about the heavy voice saying calmly, "Do not make this difficult." I wrote about the porch window reflection, the still figure inside the house watching me leave as if the act of leaving was not the end of anything. I wrote about the dust in my pocket and the SD card in my jacket lining like it had grown there. And I wrote about the clip, my stairwell filmed from the bottom step looking up, because that was the proof that broke my brain open. The words came out in uneven waves. Sometimes my hands moved fast, spilling details, chasing the relief of confession. Sometimes I stopped, fingers hovering above the keys, listening to my apartment like it was a room in court, and every sound was testimony. The truth I kept circling was simple but ugly. Fear had changed shape. Before, silence was peace. Silence was the rare moment when the world stopped demanding things from you. Silence meant you could finally breathe. Now, silence was cover. Silence was the moment something can move without being heard. It took me days to admit that to myself, and once I did, I could not unknow it. Every time the fridge clicked off, my nerves rose. Every time the HVAC paused, my body anticipated the hush. I had learned to dread the quiet the way you dread the moment right before a knock you know is coming. I paused mid-sentence and listened again, because the building around me felt attentive. The fridge hummed. The HVAC breathed. Traffic existed. The cursor blinked. My screen light reflected off the dark window above the sink, turning it into a mirror that showed my hunched shoulders and my face, pale and tight, eyes fixed on the laptop like the words themselves could hold back whatever I was afraid to name. I typed another paragraph. Then the HVAC cut off mid-cycle. The refrigerator hum died. The distant traffic sound faded into nothing so quickly it felt impossible. like someone had lowered the volume of the world for exactly 1 second. The 1 second mechanical hush. My hands stopped over the keyboard. My mouth went dry. In that hush, I heard a soft scrape from somewhere in the building, low and controlled, like a chair leg shifting on concrete. Then the world snapped back on. Fridge, HVAC, traffic. All of it returned as if the silence never existed. I swallowed and forced myself to keep typing. I told myself I would not let my body become a ritual. I told myself I would not turn this into a routine where the hush makes me stop and wait like an obedient animal. So I kept writing. I wrote the sentence I had been avoiding. The worst part is not that I ran. The worst part is that my body learned exactly what to do when someone tests me. It freezes. The cursor blinked after the period. I stared at it, and in that moment, I realized how much of this story had been about thresholds. The basement door, the guest room lock, the line of flour, the stairwell camera angle, the 1 second hush that carved the world into before and after. And now there was one more threshold, my own front door. I heard nothing at first, just the normal hum of my apartment trying to pretend it was ordinary. Then, from the direction of my front door, a sound rose that cut through everything else with surgical clarity. The doorknob turning, not fast, not forced, slow, testing, exactly the same speed as that night in Mrs. Holloway's house. The knob rotated with patient pressure, as if whoever held it had all the time in the world to feel how the lock responded, as if they were not trying to break in, but trying to confirm something. My entire body locked. The urge to stand, to shout, to run to the door was there, but it was immediately smothered by something colder. The memory of my own weakness. The sheet pulled up to my chin. The way I held my breath until it hurt. The way the light hit my shoe and then moved away, waiting for me to panic. I sat at the table with my hands on the keyboard and did not move. The doorknob stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but my own pulse. Then the knob turned again, a fraction more. Like the person outside was learning the exact point where resistance begins. It was not a break-in. It was a measurement, a test. My eyes drifted to the peephole down the hall, but I did not stand. My phone lay near the laptop, but I did not reach for it. My mouth opened slightly as if I might speak, but no sound came out. Because the truth was sitting right there in front of me, blinking on my screen. They learned I freeze. The doorknob eased back into place with the same quiet precision. No bang, no kick, no anger. Just that careful motion, like a hand withdrawing after touching something it already owns. And then, softly, footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Not running, not hurrying. A slow shift of weight, moving away. My hands started typing again before I consciously decided to. The keys clacked in the quiet like tiny bones. I kept writing because stopping felt like giving them what they wanted. I kept writing because if I went to the door, I would become the scene they were building. The cursor moved forward with each word, and I understood, with a cold clarity that made my stomach sink, that the final horror was not that they found me. It was that they did not need to rush once they did, because now they knew exactly what kind of person I am when the knob turns. They knew I sit still. They knew I listen. They knew I keep typing.